or which counts?
Okay, we are live. So, for anybody out there, welcome to the October edition of the American Praetorians live stream, or whatever we're calling this thing. We've got Steve Diamond, an old friend and true horror aficionado, since it is October. And,
that's right.
So, it's a good time to talk about spooky stuff. And I did actually have a book come out that has this month that has a fair bit of spooky stuff in it. So that helps too.
Did you come out with like the YouTube algorithm playbook? Is that
not quite that spooky?
I was gonna say, because you gave us rules about like what we were allowed to say. So really? I'm not gonna do the whole I'm not gonna do the whole smash that like button thing. I will say, if you've ever dressed up for Halloween and nobody recognized what you are, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Guys, be sure to like and comment below. The comment section is out of control. The comment section is...
I warned him.
Well,
I warned him.
That's why I'm just going to tell everyone to please like that smash button, and so, Steve, tell us about yourself.
Well, yeah. So, primarily known as a horror guy, although I kind of just write whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
you're an author, so
I know I'm
not
just
a horror guy.
Yeah, I'm very mercenary about it. But
I'm just horrifying.
No, I pretty much write whatever. Science fiction, fantasy, historical type stuff, but all of it I try to inject a little bit of horror elements into it. For the longest time, anytime I met anyone and they said, "Oh, Steve, what do you write?" and I said horror, they got this super depressed look on their face, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And so for a little while there, I started saying, "Oh, I write supernatural thrillers," because it's totally different, right? And everyone's like, "Oh, yeah, that's really cool." I'm like, "It's the same thing. What are you doing?"
It's marketing.
Yeah, marketing. But it's been different. I was just at FanX here in Salt Lake with Larry, and we were standing next to each other selling books, and pretty much anyone I said, I would ask like, "Oh, what do you read? Do you read any like supernatural horror type stuff?" And so many people were like, "Oh yeah, that's what I read now." So it's been interesting. There's been this like weird shift over the past couple of years. So that's cool. But yeah, so that's what I write. I'm known for my YA horror / supernatural thriller series. The first book's Residue. Second book is being edited right now. And then Larry Correa and I had a trench warfare dark fantasy novel come out earlier this year called Servants of War. It's been getting really, really, really positive reviews. We're really excited about it. And then I just released a short story collection of all horror stories called What Hellhounds Dream. And then Larry and I, we host the Writer Dojo podcast.
The scariest thing you've done, right?
The most is terrifying. Actually, it's terrifying listening to my own voice. You're not quite ever prepared to listen to it. You're just like, "Oh, is that what I sound like? This sucks."
That's why I don't go back and rewatch these streams.
Yeah, I saw my wife watching the last one of these we did the other day, and I just had to leave the room. Like, good God, do I really sound like that? Yes, you do. So.
I rewatch them. I just do it on mute.
So
just to watch yourself.
Why?
Look at that handsome devil.
I'm not vain at all. Yeah.
Your recent ones you just said, the ones you've just released, I think. You're young adult. Why young adult? What brought you into that particular subgenre?
When I wrote that book, it was because my wife was really big into reading all of the young adult fiction at the time. she was catching up on a bunch of things, all the usual suspects, right? Like your Hunger Games and your Divergence and whatever other clones that came out during that time, and over the last several years. And she would tell me about them, and every single story sounded the same, and every main character sounded the same, and the female characters especially all sounded stupid and dumb.
Wait, there are male characters in that genre?
There was a comic about that. My name is Wicker Basket, and I'm
Yeah.
21.
Yes, yeah, it was all that, and I remember watching some of the movies that were based off of these, and the hardest decision that any of these characters make in any of the books and movies is that they have to decide which of the 18 dudes that are like gaga for them, that they have to decide which one they want to date. And then when one of them, not even the one that they liked, breaks their heart, like they go pout in the corner for 3 weeks. And
here
so
I thought these books were unrealistic.
Oh, geez.
I mean, the target audience of those was tween girls, though. So it's
Yeah, but like I don't. Maybe it was because I hung out with. I remember back in those days and through the early days of college, a lot of the girls that were younger in those days, they were like, maybe it's because they were athletes or something, but and maybe I'm thinking about my wife who was an athlete through college, and they didn't have time for that bull crap. And so I was thinking about that stuff. And then I read this horror novel called Necroscope by Brian Lumley, which is one of my favorite horror novels. It's a straight up vampire novel, but where basically vampirism is caused by like a little piece of Cthulhu that falls to Earth. And these novels, they're violent, they're awesome, they're great fun. And I remember thinking of that and going, you know what? What if I just like aged down these characters into their late teens, and actually made a story where the girl character isn't a complete nobody and isn't a complete loser, where the guy character, where the main character is a guy, because guys actually read books too. Shocking, right? And so I wrote a character about that, and so the main character in that story, he can see the psychic residue left behind by monsters and murder victims. And then the girl reads minds. And so her whole gig is, if she can read minds, then, she's not going to try during school. She's just going to find the smartest person in the room, pick their brain, ace all that stuff so that she can focus on more important things, like how to kill monsters better. So, that was kind of the genesis of that book. And that was kind of what started me down the whole thing. I always thought I was going to be a fantasy author. And then it just never worked. And then, make vampires predatory again. That's right. But not in the like pedophile way, like in Twilight. Let's not do that sort of predatory thing. But so I started down that road, and I think that was when I realized that horror was what I was supposed to be writing, and that's how it all came about.
It's funny you mentioned Twilight, not because of the vampires, but because they took an interesting tact where they were like, oh, well, the vampires are like vegetarians, which makes sense because the main character is basically a vegetable.
Ugh. It's terrible. They're terrible. They're so terrible.
No, but the amount of like middle-aged women that are like gaga over this, high school romance novel.
I don't know if I think Twilight really kicked that off, the phenomenon where you had like women in their 30s and 40s going nuts over a young adult.
Yeah, I think Arrested Development had been a concept before that, but
I've joked before that these days the average age of a young adult reader is like 32. So
for sure. Yeah, the vast majority of the people that read mine are like, they're basically the same people that read Monster Hunter.
I guess
right?
for my question would be then, what actually classifies it as a young adult novel? If
just the age of the characters, really. You can get away with so much stuff in YA. When I used to work at a Walden Books, I managed a Walden Books back in the day. back when those still existed. And I was stocking the section where they had like all the graphic novels, and then the opposite side of it was like all the YA fiction. And this parent came over as I was stocking the comics, the graphic novels, and she started yelling at me and getting all upset because I was stocking graphic novels. And she thought that that meant that it was like all horror and slasher fiction and all this stuff, right? And
they'd be more profitable if they were, but
right, especially these days. And so I just kind of stared at her for a sec, thinking, what is she talking about? And then it clicked in my head, and I said, well, you realize the graphic just means like drawn, right? Like art. And I just pulled off like Spider-Man and opened it.
You could have just said it was a comic book and she would have understood, but you couldn't bring yourself to call it that, could you?
No, I just couldn't.
You just called it bond dessinées and really blown her mind.
Well, the thing is as we were having this conversation, her daughter is like right behind her, like looking through all these YA novels. And one of them was, I think it was Pretty Little Liars or something like that. And those YA books are filled. They're like, a lot of the YA stuff is filled with like sex and violence and swearing and all this. It's just the same thing as adult fiction. It's just that the characters are younger. And so I pointed at her and I said, if you're actually really concerned about this stuff, then maybe you should actually look at what your daughter's reading, because that book right there actually has tons of sex scenes and stuff in it. And her daughter gave me the biggest stink eye. And the parents, like, they all walked off in a huff, and I felt good about myself. But no,
that degeneracy in the bud.
But no, really, it's just the age of the characters. There's nothing. I'm equally violent in my YA fiction as I am in my adult fiction. It's, I might add a bit more humor into the YA to undercut the tone a little bit and undercut the horror smidge. But in turn, I don't pull any punches in that. But yeah, I mean, if we're talking about now, if you go to middle grade, that's where there's a lot of different lines. The age of the characters goes down further, and then in addition to that, it's the you have to kind of pull back on the violence. Oftentimes, the violence can't happen to them. There can't be any human on human violence. It can only be human on monster violence.
I mean, I can't sit here and judge too much, considering I was watching R-rated movies when I was 8. But
this explains everything.
That goes into sort of like a trend that's been around for forever. Is that if you're writing for a genre, or I guess you'd call it a genre, but an age group, that age group isn't going to want to read it. They're going to want to read the next age group up, because they're always trying to emulate the people who are older than them. So like the middle schoolers are always trying to emulate the high schoolers. The high schoolers are always trying to emulate adults, and so on and so forth. So
and then when you're a 30-year-old middle-aged woman, you just read whatever, right?
Yeah, because you're burnt out, and
I'm 41. I prefer my protagonists to be in their 50s. It's aspirational, okay?
Yeah. Like, oh, you're still alive? Cool.
You made it.
Tell me more about how everything hurts. I feel it.
How's your 401k doing?
Oh, not good today.
That's the horror genre that's coming up. It's like, yeah. Pretty soon we're gonna have like historical horror fiction about the 1980s stock market crash.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, it's coming.
There's a question where they asked which Walden Books. It was the Walden Books in Provo, Utah, and then a Walden Books in Salt Lake City in the Fashion Place Mall. Those were the two I worked at that I managed, and then they both.
I remember the Fashion Place
crashed.
Mall. They tore that mall down, didn't they?
No, the mall's still there. Yeah,
not even in 2020.
No, it's still there.
That was that's the South Mall, I think, or something. One of those malls down there got. I haven't lived in Utah in a few years, so.
They still won't let you back, huh?
Well, people used to ask me, what's it like living in Utah if you're not a Mormon? I was like, oh, it's not bad. Like, you're not allowed to use that one expressway they built, the 155 miles an hour. I forget what it's called now.
Legacy.
and they're like, and you got to pay like a 6% Gentile tax, but church tithing is 10%, so you're really coming out ahead in the game. And they would just be like,
It's the separate water fountain that gets you, though. Huh?
Yeah. We'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I see.
That's what everybody thinks about Utah if they've never been, though. It's just like, oh, it's like segregation, but on religious grounds, right? I'm like, no,
we just sit around. Most of us just want to be left alone, left to barbecue in peace.
They're just on opposite shores of the Great Salt Lake, just judging each other.
That's right.
Well,
I try to judge everybody.
The west end of the Salt Lake is like a kind of a bomb range. So.
Oh, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, when I used to work for the DoD, I had to go out there a few times.
So, we're talking about horror because it's Halloween month. So, Pete, kick us off.
Steve and I have actually had a couple of conversations along these lines over the years. Like,
oh, we have. Usually at like 2 or 3 a.m.
Yeah.
It's where the best conversations happen.
Horror's fun, man. I love it. One of the things that you and I always talk about, Pete, is how it's such a good tool. How you can just use it for everything. You can use it in any genre you want. You can have fun with it. If you want humor in science fiction, you can do it. If you want humor in military, you can do it. If you want humor or horror in all these things, you can do it. I just love how it ups the stakes and everything. I don't know about how you all feel, but that's how it is for me. I just love how it ups the stakes for the characters in the stories that you're writing or reading or the movies you're watching.
And for somebody who would want to take a crack at that themselves, what would they have to know about like how to execute that? Rather, because I think most people, the way we consume media now, it's all visual. So it's like people are kind of expecting the scary imagery and the jump scares and things like that. How would you direct them for a strictly like literary execution of that?
That is harder. Jump scares don't work in literature because
the next page is just bigger font.
Like you open it, it's like a pop-up. It's a pop-up book. Yeah.
I think some of it is just that sort of unnerving sense of something is not right here.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I've always been like the slasher genre has never done it for me, and especially as I've gotten older and much, much, much better with a gun. It's like, why are you running away screaming from this idiot? Two in the chest, one in the head.
Well, that's why all the slasher movies are about teenagers, is because they're not old enough to conceal carry.
And they get into they're like, oh, let's go have our big party at the haunted funeral home. Nothing bad will happen there. Right? People in their 30s don't do shit like that because you got to go to work the next day.
Look at this awesome wall of chainsaws. What could possibly happen here?
I mean, I just get told to leave because everybody else is not in their 30s. So.
I will say, like, slasher films never really did it much for me. And
no, me either.
It's hard. They can be downright comical sometimes, to be honest. And the one genre of horror movie that I really don't like, though, is the straight up, like, the torture porn ones.
No, like Saw or Hostel or anything like that. I feel like that would get boring, too, in a literary thing.
I think people
like in a book.
People watch that for the spectacle of it. They want to see something gross they've never seen in real life, and they kind of laugh. Usually, when you see it, people laugh at it because it's it's uncomfortable. It's like so people just laugh it off. But I'm like, I don't find it entertaining.
No.
Well, here's the other thing, and here it goes into the psychology behind it, and it's why horror movies are like the go-to date movie almost between rom-coms and horror. Horror, the idea behind it is that you build rapport better and you build a connection and a sense of affection more with people that you share a harrowing experience with. So for, like combat vets, right? It's like, hey, these are my brothers because we went through the shit together, right? For high schoolers, they don't have that. So it's, hey, let's go see a scary movie together. If we're both scared, we'll feel like a closer connection because we both saw it together and we both experienced this together.
Yeah,
I don't
there's
know how that
certainly
works
some
with
of
like
that.
reading a book together,
There,
like a scary book together.
there's certainly some of that, and also for a lot of people, horror is the safe way to experience the danger, right?
Mhm.
With a movie, you can turn it off. You can close your eyes. With a book, you can shut the book and set it down. When it comes to horror, though, for me, and I say this all the time, and I say, I said it on the Writer Dojo, and I say it everywhere I go, that it comes down to three things for me, and that's fear, dread, and then shock. So fear being, well, what are you scared of? Dread being, well, I know what I'm scared of, and that's coming up right now. And then shock being, well, crap, here it is. Um, and and if a person, if an author out there wants to implement that, um, there's nothing in those three elements that says, oh, well, this has to be a horror novel to have those three elements, right? I mean, shoot, one of the examples I always use is the book The Elfstones of Shannara by Terry Brooks. Came out like, I don't know, frickin' 1980 or 70 or something like that.
Before America peaked.
Before America peaked, as we were discussing. But that whole book, in general, it's about a demon that is following around this party of people. The demon's called the Reaper, and it's literally picking them off one by one as they're trying to go about their epic quest. I mean, it's a total horror trope. But when you tell people, oh yeah, Elfstones of Shannara, that was a great horror novel, you can't say that. It's just a fantasy novel. But it has very obvious and blatant horror tropes in it. And fiction has been, all genres of fiction take horror tropes and use them to their advantage all the time, as they should. I mean, we all do it like that. That's what we do. And uh, so when you're creating your characters or things of that nature, you're always talking about like, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses. Well, I always like to think about what are their fears. What is the thing they're scared of the most? Not like me, right? Like the joke is the on running joke is my fear of sharks, right? Not something like that. Not something super specific, but
Mike's fear of bears.
what was that?
Mike's fear of bears.
I'm not
Right.
afraid. Not afraid of bears. I have a 44.
Yeah, he's one of the biggest cataloger of bear facts on the internet.
I was merely educating people.
I was going to say, just at that point, you're just Dwight from The Office.
The best part was when I would get somebody on some poor soul, well-meaning soul on social media arguing with me about my bear facts. Like what I said, bears were like the fourth and the fifth killers of people on the fourth and fifth leading causes of death in America, and they were actually arguing with me about this. I accused him of being in league with the bears.
Well, it's like it's funnier if you know like all the bear facts that you've put forth. Like, bears are the like third highest consumer of plaid garments or something like that. Like
that seems legit.
Wasn't Stalin secretly a bear in disguise or something like that?
Secret's a strong word. I mean,
remember I said that like a bear was responsible for Paul Walker's death. You should never let the bear drive, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, those sorts of fears, they're a little niche, right? But when you think of like the Lovecraftian fears, like old primal fears and stuff, like what are those, and what does why does the character fear those things? And when you start putting that into place, those fears become integral to your story. And if they're not, then then why even put it in? Just like anything, right? Like if it's not integral to the story, then what's the point? You know? And so that would be some of my kind of beginning advice for a lot of new authors, or for authors who want to do like horror for the first time, is just focus on what your characters fear, and think about those three things: the fear, the dread, and the shock, and how you can implement those into a story. And you're going to tell a good story. Like, it's good. You're going to be fine. Like, don't overthink this stuff.
I tend to approach it from almost the opposite direction. Like, I'll start with a monster.
Oh yeah.
And in some cases, like particularly, I did this with The Lost. Our guys don't know what they're going up against, and they're all hardcore grunts, so they don't consider being afraid to be something to. That's something to be squashed way down and deep into a deep dark hole where nobody can ever see it.
Yeah, funny you mentioned deep dark holes. There's plenty of that in The Lost.
And then that thing, I just shot that thing in the face with a 50 cal, and it didn't even phase it. Now what? And then as the series goes on, things get even more complicated, and there are further dimensions to the whole thing that they have to take into consideration that they never have before. And that presents its own set of worries and fears, because hey, maybe something inside me is actually going to make me susceptible to that thing ripping my soul out through my mouth.
So would you say the fear is amongst a demographic of guys with recon Marines who take pride in being prepared for pretty much any situation? The fear is coming up across something that you don't have an answer for, you don't have a viable solution for at the ready. And then the dread would be that this world is full of those situations. Like, there's so much they don't know about that world. And then the shock is when I guess I would try to figure out the difference between the shock and the dread of, like, as they start losing guys to these situations where they didn't have the answer at the ready. Because the Lost series has a good track record of really punctuating whenever one of their guys goes down. Like, I've yet to see one scene in The Lost where it's like a character, even if they don't have that many lines or descriptions or anything beyond a name that the reader doesn't really interpret as important, when you lose them, it's an event in the book.
That's real. That's a really good point. And in horror specifically, for it to work to be its most effective, you have to do just that. You have to make people care about the characters that bad things are happening to, right?
I think the opposite of that is kind of part of the formula for your typical slasher film.
Yeah.
Usually the characters are kind of unlikable.
Yep.
They're obnoxious, except for, like, the final girl's the nice one. And I think they do that deliberately to try to, like, kind of balance it out, so it's not too extreme. The movie is more fun that way. Just seeing this, this obnoxious dipshit gets knifed through by Jason versus it being somebody you actually care about,
Well, you think about, I tend to go more towards like suspense oriented movies, like old Alfred Hitchcock movies and stuff like that, right? And you think about the movie I always use is Rear Window, which most people don't necessarily point at and say, "Oh, that's a horror movie," but it totally is, especially on the psychological and suspense side. But there's a scene I always talk about where Jimmy Stewart is looking across as his fiance or whatever she is. For some reason, he's like, "I'm going to break up with you," and she's gorgeous as stupid. Anyway, she's across the courtyard, she's breaking into the apartment of the guy who they both think is the murderer. And the way the shot is framed, I'll see if I can do this on the screen here. Let's see. So like, imagine that my hands are like the walls, right? So there are these big dead spaces in the shot. And then in between, you have the window of what Jimmy Stewart can see from across the way through his binoculars. And as the girl is going through the scene from place to place, she's vanishing in and out of the scene. And because you've spent this whole movie caring about the characters and caring about who they are, caring about their relationship to each other, seeing what their fears are, and when you get to that moment, and when she goes out of sight, and then the bad guy comes home, you see it does this really close-up view on Jimmy Stewart's face, and you see how terrified he is, and it makes sense to you in your head. And you're rooting for him and you're rooting for her and you fear for both of them. And that's really effective horror. Whereas, yeah, like you were talking about, Mike, like your typical slasher film is, well, I mean, I guess I'm kind of rooting for the slasher guy, right? like who else am I supposed to root for?
I think a lot of those movies don't take themselves that seriously either. So
they don't.
No,
like,
that was it was like
the creeper stood in line at DMV to get himself a vanity plate that says "Be eating you." You know,
that's true.
Well, that was the thing with Halloween, which wasn't the first
Jeepers
slasher
Creepers,
pick,
baby.
but it was one of the earliest ones. And the big appeal of that wasn't the shock of the killings; it was how creative the killings would be, or like how impressive it would be. Like that's how you get, the guy with the knife who's like impaled through him to the door and he swings open with the door and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Which the scariest scene in the original Halloween movie is Michael Myers walking briskly across a yard while, Jamie Lee Curtis fumbles with the lock to a door.
There was a scene, you talk about suspense in a scene, and tension. One I can think of from a movie is it's from The Exorcist 3, right?
I love that movie.
George C. Scott did it. I think you know the one I'm going to talk about then, the nurse, right? She's just establishing shot down a hallway. And there's this nurse or an orderly just pushing a cart going into one room and then the next. And nothing happens and nothing happens. And then at the very end, a guy covered in sheets comes out right behind her holding hedge clippers. And then the scene changes. So,
yeah, it's one of the fewest jump scares that like legitimately works. And there's actually a fake out jump scare before the real one. So it's a 4-minute sequence in the movie, and it's all done with one shot, and it's so boring, and it just builds up the suspense. And halfway through, there's a jump scare that turns out to be nothing, and so you're like, really, we just wasted all that time doing that? And then the next 2 minutes happens, and then you get the imagery of the possessed person coming out in the sheets and that stuff.
You can use jump scares like that strategically. I think some things get too carried away with them. Like I saw the first Paranormal Activity movie in the theater. It was fun watching everybody in the theater freak out, but it was just a series of jump scares. After a while, that stops being effective and it starts just feeling cheap.
Because you expect you come to be able to predict it, and that's part of. If you know what's coming, you can be prepared for it. Whereas if you don't know what's coming, because there's that, particularly if you get that element of the uncanny, where it's not even a matter of, oh, there's a dude with a knife. Again, I may be prejudiced, but it's like, well, that's nice. I've got a gun.
Yeah, I mean, a guy with a knife is scary, but it's not scary in like a horrifying way. It's like I could get hurt by this. This guy could kill me. Well, you can get killed by it in traffic too.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's for the scare factor of it. I like what you're saying, Pete. It's the unknowns. that no matter how competent you are, and you and I have had this conversation before, talking about competent characters in horror film and in horror itself. Because I know you write that, and I like to write that as well. And that's, no matter how competent they are, it's when you push something their way as the author, that it doesn't matter how competent they are, you can't be prepared for something like that. And what that does to the psychological makeup of that person, it causes fear, it causes extra dread, and it causes extra shock. But the other thing I really like about that sort of time is the idea that you can have a character having active participation in the story rather than passive. So much horror is victim fiction these days, right? It's just, something. I mean, that's Stephen King in a nutshell, right?
Yeah.
And
Also, if the victim is an alcoholic writer from New England.
Well, that's like 75% of Stephen King's fiction.
Right,
with an oppressive Christian bully character.
But it's only an alcoholic because him actually completing the self-insert and making him a cokehead would probably not go over well with his editors.
Probably. It probably depends on the editor. But, if you take some of these same situations and you have very competent characters who are just, pounding against that brick wall over and over again, they want to succeed. They are trying to succeed. Doesn't mean they will, but part of the joy of that type of story is seeing these really awesome, competent characters that you can root for. And again, when you root for them, then when the bad things happen to them, the impact is higher, right? Coop, you're talking about some of those scenes in Pete's books, how even some of the more minor characters or who have less lines, when their deaths happen, you feel it. It's not just like a George Martin, like a dude fell off a horse and he died moment, right? It's well, oh gosh, like I care about this character, and if I lose this character, man, I'm going to feel that one, and the other characters are going to feel that one, and that's where the best horror works.
And not so much books, but like a movie that did this really well. It was Predator, which was 3 different genres all in one movie.
Sure.
But one of those genres was horror. But like each time a character dies, it's like you feel it, because now it's not just the dwindling of the pack. It's like you just lost a huge asset, and it's like, if anybody could take this creature on, it's one of these guys. It's the guy with the minigun, Blaine,
and
or Billy with his giant machete about this big. It's like, if anybody can do it, it's them, and they can't.
It also showed that the characters cared about each other. They mourned the loss of their friends, and I think it was more impactful even though it was a testosterone injected 80s action movie. Yeah. It actually had some emotional impact in that, because they took a couple minutes that really humanized the characters.
Well, and Alien has the exact same thing.
Yep. Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that Predator and Alien have been, propped up as like the 2 giants of the action sci-fi horror genre is because they follow that idea of competent characters against just an overwhelming force that no amount of competence is going to help them, or it's not going to make the threat trivial. Alien did that more than Aliens, because Aliens, there was a lot of incompetence going on there. But
in his defense, he was a lieutenant.
Yeah. Well, even then, what you got? It's James Cameron's misunderstanding about any sort of like military engagement,
every movie he does.
But the other side of that, there's 2 more movies that I think really do it and don't get a lot of love for it. Is Dog Soldiers, where it's
excellent movie.
Yeah, where it's like they start off the film trying to fight these things with blanks, and then they have to get the real guns, and it doesn't work out that much better. But even if you can't understand half the dialogue because of those thick British accents, which you still care for a lot of the characters. Like they show their mettle and their personalities throughout this whole thing. And it's a movie where none of the characters, even though it's a horror movie, none of them are freaking out and like scared. Like half of them go out swinging to the death. And a lot of them have already made their peace with death, and it's just like, look, I'm just gonna try and get me mates out of here, and
well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not scared. It doesn't necessarily mean
they're not letting it overcome them, and yet it's still an effective horror movie because now the fear is transported or transplanted from the character to the audience. Because you as the audience member, just like, I want this guy to live. This guy's awesome. Spoon's badass. You know, he's boxing a werewolf and then just gives one of the greatest one-liners before that scene ends. But and then there's another one which nobody's heard of, and it's not high art, but it's a very competent horror movie in my mind. And it's a movie from 2020 called Underwater, and it stars every actor I freaking hate. So it's got like Kristen Stewart and TJ Miller.
I didn't see it, but
look, I'm not saying it's one of the only movies where I'll be like, hey, I kind of liked Kristen Stewart in it, even though she looks like Eminem. But it's as far as the movie goes, it's a competent movie, and it's a survival disaster horror movie.
It's straight up Cthulhuan. It's a straight up Lovecraftian.
Yeah. And it's the oppressiveness of the environment that they're in. Yep. It's like every cubic centimeter of water around them is instant death. It's going to kill them. And then they have all these other problems on top of that. And the entire group, there's no idiot who's trying to screw over the rest of the group or causing problems for them. They're all working together, and they're all like generally good people who are looking out for each other and having each other's backs. And that's what like kind of guts you as they start dying. And it's like, the more I think about it, it's like, there's not a lot of deaths in there, but there's a lot of that dread. It's a lot of, what's coming, sort of a horror element to it. And I think that's what puts it over the edge for me, even though like a lot of people don't like it. They say it's an Alien ripoff or something like that, but
it definitely starts out that way. I mean, even the opening scene is very much framed the same way as Alien is, right?
Right.
But once you get going further and you start getting those little hints that this isn't Alien, this is Lovecraft, that's when things get pretty good. It has some bad voiceover. I think that's the biggest issue for me, is the voiceovers that are in the beginning and end of it. You're right.
They had no point in being in there at all.
No point. But you're right though. Like that's actually a pretty fun movie to watch. And then the other one that I put in there with like Alien and that is excuse me, with Alien Predator is The Thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't. I mean, the characters' reactions are so real that half the time your reactions, the things that you're thinking, the things that you say, like as you see the spider head, like
what the
you say the same, say and think the same thing that the characters do in the show. Yep. And if you can achieve that, then you get buy-in. And Kurt Russell, I mean, come on.
Yeah,
he's so likable in the movie. Like
Keith David.
Yeah.
And, the great thing about that movie is the characters were becoming their own horror enemy. It was that paranoia.
Yes. Well, I mean, gosh, every I don't know, pretty much every show that loosely considers itself horror has done the Thing ripoff. I mean, X-Files did it in season 1 with the episode Ice.
Yeah.
And then which was a great episode of X-Files, by the way. I love that episode.
Yeah, that actually was the first comic book I believe I owned, was the comic book adaptation of Ice.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, even the show Supernatural did an episode of that in like season 9 or something like that. Like all the shows do it because
Right.
paranoia is
Yeah.
a really good way to get quick buy-in from the audience.
And they all did it better than the sequel to The Thing. Like,
oh, the sequel prequel.
yeah.
The interesting thing is going over some of this stuff is that there still has to be a certain factor, because paranoia, within a certain context, that just makes a really good thriller.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, particularly the last couple of volumes of the American Praetorian series, I cranked the paranoia up as far as I could get it, because there's all this stuff going on behind the scenes, and there's no telling, okay, are these people actually here to help us out, or are they here to stick a knife in our ribs?
But do you think the reason that it works both for a horror work and a thriller work is because the paranoia is just a delivery mechanism for tension? So
yes, and again, what I think I'm going to keep coming back to this because it forms kind of the basis of at least my tastes in horror, is that sense, that uncanny twist that turns it from a thriller to horror.
oh yeah, I couldn't tell from reading.
There is something not natural going on here.
Yeah, I think that's the twist. Yeah.
With Lovecraft, it was these vast ancient aliens, basically, that are completely incomprehensible, and realizing what they are drives you out of your mind, because they're something so completely beyond humanity that they can squish you without even noticing they've done it.
Now,
I want you to finish your thought, but I want to come back to that because I've heard a pretty good theory about what the actual madness in Cthulhu is. So, but keep going.
Where I've generally tried to go is because particularly with some of the Jed Horn books, which not a whole lot of people admittedly have read.
Some of your best
some
work.
people describe the atmosphere is kind of Lovecraftian, particularly with, I think, the third one. But with Lovecraft, the indifference of the monsters is kind of the core source of horror. That you're just a dust mote compared to this thing.
Right.
I
would compare Jed Horn more to Solomon Kane, but
there's a little bit of several influences in Jed Horn.
Ordo's read
what I was going with more for, and I brought this into the Lost increasingly in the second trilogy, there is that you've got something that is vastly ancient, vastly knowledgeable, vastly powerful, and it knows who you are.
So like that, well, that scared Mike off, but
yeah, apparently so.
It's like,
It's
like the IRS.
He's like, heck no, I'm out. It's funny when Larry Curry and I, when we wrote Servants of War together, it was, the whole idea was, it was trench warfare fantasy, right? But the more and more we outlined and brainstormed and kind of put the world together, the more we realized we wanted it to be more weird, kind of like how Sword and Sorcery, right? Sword and Sorcery is like fantasy, but with a weird edge to it, right? That's kind of what we wanted to do, and we took a lot of those sort of tactics that you're talking about, Pete, and that's that there are these ancient, horrible, terrible gods, and they have ancient, horrible, terrible, horrid, terrible fairy creature things at their disposal, and they know who you are, and they'll sick them after you. And it doesn't matter if you're in a suit of armor, which some of these guys are. It doesn't matter. Like, try your best, and high fives on the way out, but it's probably gonna end poorly for you, especially if they really truly focus on you. And there's so much fun, fear, and dread that you can access in that, and that you can play with in that. But yeah,
what I like about that though is it's like, all right, if the World War I Red Army got its hands on like a Voltron ripoff,
yeah,
and tried to wreck house doing that, and it still wasn't enough because all those ancient fairy tales that you told your kids to scare them into behaving good were real, and they have no idea how to counter that. So it goes back to like what Pete was saying with the Lost. Is like, we usually have the answers, or at least we take pride in having the answers and being able to act and protect and kill what needs to be killed. And suddenly you can't. And now you have to figure out how to do that. And that adds that extra dynamic, that conflict of, we don't even know what the answer is. It's one thing to be like, all right, we've got to accomplish mission A. It's like, we've got to shut down this blue laser, like in every Marvel movie, right? But that's a conflict in and of itself. But you don't even know like what's going on. You don't know where the blue laser is. You don't know what it's going to do. You have to figure that out in the same time frame that it would take you to have the fight with Loki or something like that. There's an added dimension there.
And that added dimension is, again, that's a source for a lot of that sense of the uncanny, especially when, like, Marines tend to be fairly earthy, sort of practical materialists. If we can see it, drink it, eat it, or do other unmentionable things to it, it's real.
You got to test all methods, so.
Yeah. Whereas what these guys run into in the Lost, or in any number of other, is that there's stuff out there that you can't necessarily see, but it can still get you. There's stuff you can't shoot. There's an entirely different dimension that you never thought was real, and all of a sudden it is, and you have no idea how to approach it.
This kind of ties into a thought I had, and it's kind of the difference between the movie Alien and the movie Aliens, right? One was more horror, one was more action oriented. A YouTuber I watch sometimes, called The Librarian, calls this crossing the Ash threshold, right? Referring to Ash from Evil Dead and Army of Darkness.
So it's not a Pokemon thing.
No, it's when you different Ash. It's when you go from.
There's nothing scarier than a 12-year-old that stays 12 for 30 years, dude.
Judging you.
But it's when you go from barely understanding what's going on and being just terrified of it to still being kind of terrified but knowing how to fight back. And you see this a lot in like your survival horror games towards the end, when you have more equipment and more ammo and more guns, and you can just start finally mowing the monsters down, like in your Resident Evil games and such. And I think what separates like Dog Soldiers from a more conventional werewolf movie, it's not that they were able to easily fight off the werewolves or anything, but they had a chance. They fought back. There were quips, and there was good dialogue along the way, much like Ash, versus just being a victim of it the whole time and being completely helpless. And those make for two kind of different horror genres. Like it's the difference between like Predator and some other movie where the monster is just stalking hapless victims. And I prefer that genre, I think, in a more of a film, and even in a video game. I don't like the types of games, the horror games, where you just have to run and hide, like Locker Hiding Simulator.
Alien Isolation.
Yeah.
Kind of fight back. I loved Alien Isolation, though. You could kind of fight the threats in there. You just had to be smart about it.
Well, that's like the difference between like Predator and Jeepers Creepers, right? Like Predator is out there and they kind of sort of hunt and run from the monster. Whereas Jeeper Creepers, they just run. Like they can't do anything.
Yeah.
Right. But
would you say that the most distilled difference is one before the ash threshold, you're trying to get away from the threat. Post ash threshold, you're going towards the threat because if you don't take care of it, it's going to do all this horrible stuff.
Yeah,
with the chainsaw upper hand.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in the original, Evil Dead movie as the film progressed, and there's obviously an Army of Darkness. Army of Darkness isn't really a horror movie, but
no, Army of Darkness is a spoof.
Yeah, Colin, they made their own parody of it.
Colin, that is pretty much exactly what we're talking about there.
Yeah. Well, and it's really interesting too, because you can the fear and the dread that they all feel in Aliens, it comes from a different angle, right? Like, so the scene in Aliens where Ripley and Newt are trapped in like the office thing because bad scientist dude has thrown a face hugger in there with them. And the reason that scene is terrifying, one, it's a little bit quieter. It's more isolated. It gives you more the alien feel. But Ripley knows exactly what that's going to do to him if it gets a hold of him. And she has that maternal instinct to protect Newt. And there's an argument to be made that Newt maybe kind of knows what's going on with him, right? Maybe yes, maybe no.
She's been on the moon long enough. She saw it happen to everybody else.
She saw literally everybody else get pulled away. So, that they kind of know what's coming, and they know how horrible and terrible it's going to be, just from this little thing that's about this big. That is going to cause that is the cause of untold horrors upon them.
And it helps think for that too. Just how like gross and squig the monster, the face hugger. It's a spider with a tail that face rapes you. I mean, that sets off all your. It's everything horrible.
Thanks, Geiger.
Yeah.
It's very Japanese for a Swiss guy. But the thing about that scene too is how it steps up as the scene progresses, because at first she wakes up and everybody's gone except for them, right? So they're alone. That already has her hackles raised. Then she sees that the facehuggers are missing. So that immediately kicks in. And then she sees that her rifle's missing. The last line of defense that she had to protect them. So now that's even worse. And then when she realizes how screwed they are, and the facehuggers running around like it's actually made contact and they've fought it off. They don't know where it is. She keeps calling on the comm for Hicks, and there's no answer. So that's another step up, to the point where she has to set off the sprinklers just so that somebody in the facility will know that there's a problem, right? So there's this constantly ramping up how screwed she is. And that adds to the effectiveness of the scene. How would you kind of translate that into a literary form, Steve, Pete, Mike?
Well, let Steve go first, as I've never actually written horror, so I'm interested to hear what he has to say.
Gosh, part of it, does setting the tone for the scene. Like, what are you expecting in there? And from the movie does that, right? Just like you were talking, where, they wake up, they start feeling things are certain that are unwrong, or that are just totally wrong. And Pete talked about a little bit of this earlier, that something's off, something is out of the ordinary, that things just aren't right. That feeling, writing that feeling that things are just not right, is probably one of the easier things to kind of help facilitate that emotion. And then depending on if you're writing in first person, that it becomes a little bit easier, I think, because you can delve into the emotion and the memories and the smells and the sounds a little bit more viscerally than you can a little bit removed if you're telling a story in, say, third person limited. And when you start telling these stories and you have to, the reader has to believe maybe that they're not, the readers often aren't scared when they're reading horror stories. There's no music cues, there's no jump scares, things of that nature. But if the reader can easily believe that the character is freaked by whatever's happening, then that gives you instant buy-in. And a lot of that instant buy-in also comes from just you caring about the characters. Whether we're talking about, it's like the idea of short fiction. The idea of short fiction is how quickly, for me, a good piece of short fiction is how quickly can you make me care about the character, regardless of what genre it's in. The quicker I can care about that character, if we're talking about a horror story, is essential. It is essential for me.
So all your characters going forward are going to be Baby Yoda, basically.
Totally. It just depends. Like I wrote one kind of Lovecraftian story about a janitor on a space station. I wrote another. I wrote another short story. It's just a flash piece. It's only like 1,500 words, and it's about a woman who is exhausted after having her first kid, and she's kind of going through a little postpartum. When you have your first kid, like everything is scary, everything, and you're just exhausted all the time, no matter what, and no matter how bad like the dude thinks it is, like it's even worse for the woman, right? She's beyond exhausted and she's so beyond connected to that little life. And so any threat to that is absolutely terrifying. And so within 1,500 words, I wrote a story that says, hey, how quickly can I make you care about this woman's fears and the things that she's dreading and stuff like that. So the quicker you can make that reader care, the easier all of these things that we're talking about can come to pass.
So it becomes less about you scaring the reader and more like, hey, I gave you a friend that you just made, and now you care about this person, and now I'm going to put them through hell, and that's what's going to get you invested in this and also mad at you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the guys in the comments, Colin, he said something like he made a comment earlier to something to the effect of, are you wanting the readers to make friends with your characters? And in a way, yeah, I am, because that investment, that connection. I mean, like, look, we're all buddies here, and we care, right? And if something were happening to each other's families, we would care. And if you can instill just a fraction of that between the reader and the characters within the story, it makes it very real, and it helps you really internalize the challenges that they're going through. I mean, really, can I'm trying to think if I've ever actually been scared by a book, like actually scared. That's fiction, and I'm not sure that I ever have.
A lot of nonfiction that can scare you.
No, nonfiction is a different thing. Nonfiction is an entirely different game, right? But fiction wise, I don't know that I've ever actually been scared by a book. And I've read all the horror. I mean, I've read all the things. But and when I write stuff, I'm not like, oh, this is scary. I'm like, oh, I think that the characters are going to be freaked out by this, and I think that my readers are going to have fun with this scene. Like that. That's my thought process.
Right.
But maybe that says more about me than than what I write.
Oh.
What about you, Pete?
I don't know about being scared by a book. I have. This was a long time ago when I basically got my start as a storyteller at campfires up in the mountains, giving Boy Scouts nightmares. And yeah, when you can actually have them hallucinating that there is something moving around outside the campsite before you leave, you know you did it right. If you have to remind yourself on the way through the dark back to your own tent that you made it all up out of your head, then you definitely did it right. I may have had to do that time or two. But sometimes I think if you do it right, like I had somebody comment on a particular scene in the latest book of The Lost, The Alchemy of Treason, that he doesn't usually have anything set him off his feet, but he had to put the book aside just so he could finish lunch because of a particular scene that I had written in that, because it was so disturbing. And it was our guys coming across the remains of a human sacrifice.
Okay, so it wasn't the cursed arrow?
No.
That was from book 2, never mind.
That was from book 2. And I'm still working on
topping. I know Walt is a fan of that scene.
Yeah, I'm still working on topping that to creep Walt out. But there are times where I think, and it's not necessarily a matter of graphic violence like you'd have in like a slasher movie or torture porn or something of that nature. But if you can create enough of a solid concept of that thing, whatever it is, particularly if it's just out of sight in the reader's imagination, then in a way you're kind of bringing it out of the page in a way that you usually only see with movies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I may not be articulating that all that well, but
I can get it, because if we're talking about like being actually afraid or like scared from a book, I don't even know how you would kind of classify that, like, because it doesn't make you afraid to keep reading or anything like that, whereas like say being scared through a visual medium like a movie or something like that, there are people who will pause it and just walk away because they don't want to continue. But I think I've had oh shit moments, right? Where it's like where you're just like okay, something, a gear just got turned up, and like you have a biological reaction, like your heart starts pumping a little bit more, and that would have been, I think Larry is actually responsible for the 2 I can think of. One was in the first Son of the Black Sword book, and it's where his character Rada is like sneaking into the library, and she locks it behind her. There's no other way that anybody can get in, and it's completely dark. And as she's like trying to sneak her way back out, she touches a face that obviously wasn't there, and it's a living face. And so it's like when I read that, I went back to, as a kid, I did a lot of like urban exploration in old abandoned, supposedly haunted spots. Like we had a abandoned insane asylum around where I lived, where it's like, you would just go through the wreckage and the ruin and all that. And of course we would like try and jump out and scare each other and that stuff. But it was also, it's like, that's where MS-13 hung out. so there was like legit threats there. So it's like, if somebody was in one of these rooms and you didn't know about it, that was like a real scary experience. So it gave me a mental callback to that. The other one is in his second Malcontent series books, where it's Into the Wild.
Into the Wild.
And I didn't know enough about like the War Machine or Horde's backstory, so I didn't like know what these certain factions were capable of. So when the main group of guys, their camp gets assaulted, they get assaulted by teleporting werewolves, which up
Yeah.
until this point, I knew they were werewolves. I didn't know they could freaking teleport just like out of nowhere. So I was like, oh, okay. So now you just have a pack of werewolves in.
And Coop's hardware just failed him again.
You're muted.
Yeah, I tried to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just like, it's like, that's what I'm talking about, where you get that sort of like your heart starts pumping a little more. Cause I was driving doing this stuff. So I'm like trying to focus on multiple things. And I'm like, it's like, oh, okay. So now they're screwed. Like,
Now that is an interesting point, Coop. That like if you listen to audiobooks, if the narrator is really good at his or her job, you can actually uh, you can actually inject a bit more tension and horror into the scenes that will impact a person, because then words on a paper elicits very different reactions than hearing things or smelling things, right, or tasting things,
right.
or like watching a scene. And yeah, I've listened to sections of horror novels where I'm like, oh, okay, nice, yeah, like this is good. Like,
Well, it goes back to what Pete was saying about like telling the stories around the campfire. You know, there's somebody who's controlling the narration for you and adding a mood and attention to it that you as a reader might not add yourself.
Well, and you're kind of a captive audience in a way. I mean, you can always press pause, right? But when you're in a little like aluminum coffin car, right? And you're listening to an audiobook, if it's a creepy scene that's really well executed, like you're kind of a captive audience and you kind of feel trapped by it. And that's a very cool feeling for horror novels in the audio form. That's very cool.
Okay, we are now in hour 2. So how about what are some of your favorite genres of horror, guys? And let's start with Steve, because he's our guest. So what kind of things do you like? And it could be if it's in books, if it's in movies, if it's in just in general. Throw some out there.
Ooh, I'm under the kind of the big giant horror umbrella. The things I don't like the slasher fiction or the torture porn, but I think we're all kind of in that same boat, right? What I do really like are I do like psychological horror quite a bit. I do like straight up like monster movie romps. I do love those. Look, we were talking about like the Jeepers Creepers thing earlier. Like those movies are fun. Like I'm not there to watch like glorious American cinema. I'm there to watch this like weird scarecrow monster thingy who, as you talked about earlier, Mike, like apparently went to the DMV and got a personalized license plate. I'm there to watch him mow down these teenagers that no one cares about.
Or the cinematic classic Split Second starring Rutger Hauer.
The thing is, that's like 3 different horror genres. They are not put together. They are just like put in order. Like you start out with this supernatural sort of spiritual horror that turns into a mutant monster horror, which turns into this environmental horror, which goes back to the mutant monster horror.
Yeah, it's all that stuff. I like a small, not crazy amounts, but I like a small amount of the body horror stuff, which I think Alien and The Thing kind of touches into. Or that that movie that came out that was also kind of an Alien ripoff, Life. That one was actually okay too, especially the end. I like that sort of stuff, but I also really love heavy suspense, like heavy suspense. All of the, I think back to like Hitchcock's The Birds, where by the end of the movie, the characters are walking away and and all the birds are just sitting around and they're kind of staring at him and they're like, what happened? Like at the end of the movie, no one knows why. No one knows why it went nuts. No one knows why it happened.
Well, you get the answer in the sequel, Birdemic, Shock and Horror.
You're a monster.
Or the Italian classic Beaks.
Or my favorite piece of short fiction ever, and my favorite horror story ever, is the Matheson story I Am Legend. And I know Pete and I have talked about this before.
I fucking love that book.
It's so good. It's so good. And the reason why I like it is because it's truly a story about who is the real monster. And the reason why I love monsters so much in stories is because it's effectively a mirror, like a dirty mirror of the human soul, where you hold up this mirror and it's like, okay, well, what happens if you take away this or this or this from me, or you add this horrible, terrible thing or add this horrible, terrible thing to a human? What do they turn into? And it's that reflection. And in I Am Legend, the idea that he is the boogeyman at the end, and that this new group of vampire race or whatever, they're like, dude, you're the thing that we're scared of. You're the thing that goes bump in the day, you know? And that's so appealing to me. That stuff is so appealing to me. And those are the type of horror monster type movies that really, really work for me in stories and stuff, where I look at the monsters and I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see what's happening here. Or I look at the characters and I'm like, well, who's worse? Is it these humans or is it that monster? I do, as one of the comments, Dee Dee Connor says, I do really like apocalypse stories as well. I really do.
Well, that I Am Legend sort of
that's totally an apocalypse
indirectly
story.
created that genre with because even Night of the Living Dead, that was George R. Romero just basically ripping off that book and trying to turn it into a movie. He thought vampires would be too obvious, so he changed it to zombies.
Yeah.
And then 28 Days Later.
I actually quite like 28 Days Later.
Right. Yeah, but they modeled it off of I Am Legend. So
exactly.
when the movie I Am Legend came out with Will Smith, people were like, well, this is just 28 Days Later. I was like, well, 28 Days Later was just I Am Legend. So
yeah. Well, and then on top of all that, I adore Lovecraftian horror. I just adore it. Like, it's like my irrational love of food trucks. Like, I love everything about Lovecraftian horror. I love reading those stories. I love watching the movies. I quite liked the new adaptation they did of Color Out of Space. I thought it was extremely well done.
Nicolas Cage and his Nicolas Cageiest.
They let him be full Nicolas Cage, and it worked so well for me.
I haven't seen that one. Have you seen the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society versions of Call of Cthulhu and Whisper in Darkness?
No, I was talking about that with, I want to say it might have been Tony Weisskopf the other day. But yeah, I need to see those.
They do them straight up like old 20s, 30s. Like Call of Cthulhu is actually silent. And then
that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I hope that it actually comes to pass that Guillermo del Toro gets to make his At the Mountains of Madness movie. That's been something they've been like trying to make happen for the past 20 years or longer. And
did you guys see Antlers?
So that's the one about the Wendigo?
Yeah, it's really well done. I've come to the conclusion that Guillermo del Toro is at his best when he's given a limited budget. And so he has to focus on storytelling, because all of the movies where he has like smaller budgets and stuff, they're all like, they're really good movies. Like Pan's Labyrinth. Come on. Like that's there's nothing not to like about that movie. I adore that movie. Even the Orphanage, both the English and the Spanish versions are pretty good. And then Antlers, the most recent one, is really good. And so I I love all that sort of stuff. Um, that's those are I yeah that's my really super stupid long answer to your question, Mike.
Who's up next?
Who know you would like so much about horror?
I know it's weird.
Steve
Super
Diamond
weird.
liking horror? What?
I know. My license plate in Utah literally says horror. I got it personalized. It's awesome.
Did you get the 0 or the O?
The 0. Yeah, the 0. I was surprised it was available. But
So, Coop, your turn.
What kind of horror do I like?
Yeah.
I think more the suspenseful, supernatural horror. A lot like The Exorcist, both the book and the movies. Well, except for the second one, that was absolute garbage. But where it's you're up against something that you like can't hope to defeat through any means that you know of, or even when they have the exorcist come in, they understand the who have the tools to go up against this thing. They understand the gravity of the situation, and it's for the clergy characters in the exorcist. The horror isn't, oh no, we're fighting a demon. It's, if we fail, this little girl is toast. Like her soul's screwed, her body's screwed, her relationship with her family is screwed. Like, they understand the gravity of what they're fighting for, and it goes to back with the ash threshold. Why would you possibly go towards that threat? Is because something way worse is going to happen if you don't. And when you can't beat it with a chainsaw hand or a double barrel shotgun, that adds that added dynamic to it, where it's like, what tools do you possibly have to go up against something that is so old and so ancient and so experienced in this battlefield that you're saying you're the underdog is an overstatement. Like, you are, or an understatement.
I think
you're a flea in this.
I think that's part of the enduring popularity of like Lovecraftian style horror and like religious themed horror like that, because both of them are dealing with an element that's just something beyond the normal human experience. Something you can't just shoot, you can't contain, you can't deal with in the ways you could deal with a more immediate threat to your physical being. And there's something deeply terrifying about that. That's a very primal fear in people. I think it's it's one of the reasons people are scared of dark and spooky buildings. It's not because they think there's a serial killer hiding in there,
right? But you can also take the supernatural aspect out of it, like Alien and Predator. You're still going up against this monster that just seems to outclass you in everything, and they obviously know more about you than you know about them. And in lieu of a monster, then you have like the survival horror genres, where it's this environment in itself is so oppressive, and it's literally a force of nature that you have no chance of overcoming except through a very thin line of just like grit and ingenuity. And even then, not everybody's going to make it. So you have the three factors. You have the fear, the dread, and the shock. And like Servants of War does it. The Lost does it. Mike, your next horror book is probably going to do it. But it combines all of those. So it's like in The Lost, you have the supernatural aspect, you have the monster aspect, and you have the environment aspect. Same thing with Servants of War. You have,
for sure,
you're fighting this enemy army, and just the terrors of normal human on human combat is going to get you. Plus, you're undersupplied and completely under-equipped to even make it out alive. And then you have all these added extra components onto it, which is the supernatural and the environment around you. Just everything is everything is against you and you're an insect to this. So
Yep. Now, Coop or Mike, I want to.
we both go by
Actually,
Coop. It's all right.
I know that was the problem. Gosh, so difficult. There was one thing that you said about kind of the religious horror stuff, um, and how it's been so enduring because of the kind of the primal fear that it invokes. Now, as a dude of faith, um, there's there's a kind of a flip side aspect to that as well, and that's that you're always equipped, right? I mean, you look at a lot of the religious, like a lot of the religious horror type themes and stuff, and one of the, you know, what Coop you were talking about, like, oh, you don't have a chainsaw, you don't have this, you don't have a gun, but you always have like your faith in yourself and your faith in something. If there is a super horrible, terrible uh, force of bad that could come at you, well, as a guy of faith, then you also have the belief that um, that there's a supreme good as well, right?
Right.
And one of the things I just adore about horror is the contrast of the good and the bad. Um, the bright is made brighter because of the darkness, and the dark is made darker because of the brightness.
Right.
And though anyway, that
Well,
thought came into my mind when
you'll
you
notice
brought that up, Mike.
you're right, which is also why so many of the supernatural religious horror, either movies or books, deal with a character who has lost that faith or never had it. And so it's also the journey of, okay, you might not even believe that you are equipped, or that this equipment that you, or this thing that you can use to fight back the evil even exists. And so it's a journey of getting that and using it against the evil. And so it's like The Exorcist. Father Karras believes he's lost his faith about like halfway through the story. The Exorcist 3 is about George C. Scott coming to terms with faith and believing and using that to fight back against the demon. Like, he likes the priest because they're good people and they're his friends, not because he has like this connection to the religion. The Exorcist movies, like The Rite, or there was a terrible one with Eric Bana, but that's besides the point. But all of them, it's about this character, whether he's a priest or not, who is at odds with the faith, and he has to come around to it, not just because like it's, obviously Christianity is real, so just believe in that. It's the idea of like, okay, if I believe hard enough, I have this tool against the devil or the demon. For anybody who hasn't had a literal come to Jesus moment or a religious experience, do you realize how hard it is to actually get that faith? Like, that is a very, very tough journey just for us who aren't facing physical manifestations of demons. So for these characters, it's going to be even harder. And it adds that extra component to the story and extra stakes too. So
That's super well said. That's super well said.
yeah, as I said, it's like, how do you know that you're believing enough? Or what if you're not worthy? What if you've spoiled any chance of being the conduit for good in this conflict?
Or,
So,
and let me throw this out there, like, I think for like people of faith, there's a lot of things in life that you just never get to see. You don't really get a lot of confirmation that the supernatural world is like a real physical thing, because it's a matter of faith. To see something like that just dropped in front of you, just to be confronted with it, there's your shock value right there. So once you get over that hump, then doubt creeps into your mind, because like, well, what if what the things I was told weren't accurate? What if I don't actually have the equipment for this? What if it's not enough? And I think one thing that distinguishes Lovecraftian horror from religious horror too is that Lovecraftian horrors are indifferent. Religious horror is very, very personal because you're possessing demons. It knows you. It's trying to get you in your soul. It knows every fear, every weakness, everything you feel bad about, everything you've done wrong, and it will use those against you. And it becomes very, very personal. So
that's the Constantine quote, right? Like,
yeah.
like, oh, I don't believe in the devil, and he goes, he believes in you.
And the more,
right?
the more, and the forces of darkness there will then kind of play on that to try to get you to succumb. And that's what I think the big difference between those two subgenres is. And I think it's one of the reasons that, for me, especially, like religious horror tends to be particularly, even if it's not particularly scary, it's just more engaging that way. Like, I thought The Exorcism of Emily Rose was a great film. I only thought it was like actually scary in a couple of places, but it really wasn't about that. It was about this big battle between this poor young girl and forces she couldn't begin to comprehend.
That movie also had some pretty effective jump scares, just because whenever she shows up in the room and she's all contorted and that stuff, it almost mixes the body horror with the supernatural horror. But it also to piggyback off of your point of, like that's the shock value, is like now this thing that you've never encountered before is here. I think they weave that in a lot of these religious horror or supernatural horror movies. Is you have this atheist character or this lapsed character who is lapsed or unbelieving because in the context of the story, like they have never seen anything that's proven God is real or interested in them or whatever. And now they have a demon or the devil incarnate in front of them. So they know he's real, but they still haven't seen God. So now it feels like one side has shown up to the game where the other side hasn't. And that's usually where they hit their low point in the film or the book or whatever. That's like the second act low point or something, where they're like how can we call on God when he hasn't shown up? And that's usually the climax or the conclusion to the conflict, is where they say, well, he did show up and he showed up through me and all that. Yeah. And so that's how they fight back.
And I think that's actually a way that you can, and I think that's actually a way that you can pursue that kind of story with a character who actually isn't necessarily an atheist or has lost their faith. And even though they may still have those sort of spiritual tools, the immediate effect isn't always necessarily going to be there. And they've got to basically hold on by their fingernails or succumb, because it's like grace isn't a light switch that you get to reach out and flip.
And I think
it's funny. There's a really good scene in a not horror movie, depending on how you look at it, Hacksaw Ridge, where he has been touting his faith and sticking to it the entire first half of the movie. And then they reach their low point, and he says to God, it's like, what is it you want of me? I can't hear you. So now he's at his low point where this anything but atheist, this very devout Seventh-day Adventist, is now finally questioning God. And it's probably one of the more realistic divine intervention stories, in my opinion, which is where he doesn't get a direct response from God, but he starts hearing the screams of his comrades in the back. And so he's like, well, I'm a medic. These people need a medic. Okay. Like, I get it. And then he goes, and then the rest of the movie happens. So it's not a horror, but it hits what we're kind of talking about, where you get that low point. And while most stories tend to fall into the atheist or the lapsed believer, you can do it with somebody who still has the faith about them. So,
and I think another factor that comes in for the shock value, the realization that this is actually happening, is even amongst people that are devoutly religious, we're still, rational creatures that we live in the world. Somebody tells you, "Oh, I saw a demon." Your first response is, "Okay, whatever." You probably saw a meth head.
I always get those two confused.
There's a difference between being like
it's the same picture.
There's a difference between being religious and superstitious, and
Explains Florida.
There's a lot of fake stuff out there. Like, good luck trying to find an actual ghost video on YouTube. So after a while, it's easy to convince yourself in the real world, and presumably for your characters too, that none of this stuff is real. It's just scary. It's just superstition. It's not what it seems like it is. It's not like it isn't meant literally. And then they'd be faced with something. Oh no, this is literally real.
But and you'll see that too, and that usually encompasses like at least the first two acts, is where even if they're a believer, they'll run down the list of all the things that it could be and isn't. And while they're doing that, the evil force is making more and more headway and getting the advantage, because the good character really isn't doing anything to counter it, because they're still trying to find out, it's like, what could this be other than the worst of the worst, which would be a supernatural threat.
That was part of like the thrust of the plot of The Exorcism of Emily Rose is, she died during the exorcism, and the priest was put on trial for it. And the prosecutor, or the prosecuting attorney in this case, was, he's a pastor. He was a Protestant pastor. He taught Sunday school. He wasn't an atheist, but it was this kind of like this conflict of the normal world that we live in versus the world of the supernatural. And one man had saw it for himself, and he was trying to convince this other man who hadn't seen it that it was real. And even if you believe, I think it's one thing to believe, it's another thing to actually see it happening in real time, I think. And I think that shock value is one of the things that's, for me, it's kind of like one of the more like emotionally powerful parts of like an exorcism film or an exorcism story, is that you get kind of a confirmation you don't normally get in life, that, oh no, this shit's real. Yeah. And now you got to fight it. So it's horrifying, but also maybe in a way kind of like hope inspiring. Hopeful. You get a little.
And the other thing I want to point out to anybody in the chat who thinks that this is going to be like a conversion stream, it's including Mike, which got it's not limited to just Christianity. Like, there's a lot of really good Korean horror films where they go into like the shamanism and sort of like the I guess pagan, the indigenous religions of Korea before they became a Christian nation. I would love to see a Hindu movie, about like a Bollywood Hindu movie without the music, but where it's this supernatural horror thing.
I actually saw a movie like that. We found it on Amazon Prime. My wife and I watched it. I cannot remember the name of it, but the plot of it was this guy is kind of like a down on his luck loser, right? Well, he inherits his family's old palace. It's like this old palace somewhere in the Indian countryside. It's all run down and it's been abandoned and looted. Well, down in the bottom of a well, he finds a passage to like a Hindu. It's like the womb of a Hindu god, right? And there's a being in there that has a bag of gold. And you're able to steal the bag of gold. And he keeps doing this over and over again. He has like a system down pat. And the crux of the plot is him falling into a life of this like corruption and greed, where he gets greedier and greedier and keeps going back for more and more. He ends up taking a mistress and cheating on his wife, and he ends up corrupting his son too. And it drives him to ruin because it's greedy and he's messing with forces he doesn't really understand.
It sounds like a parable from like 1001 Nights.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of old stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
all over the world, really.
That is an ancient story in almost every culture too.
Yeah.
And,
I could see I could see the Grimm brothers coming up with something like that too.
the
Or
man
for the new
undone by
ones.
greed and meddling in things he doesn't understand. That's why, even though we watched it with subtitles and it was a foreign film from a religion I don't know anything about, but it was still a very good movie. You kind of hit on like a core level, like, okay, you understand what's going on here, even if it's from a completely foreign culture.
One of the better books as far as getting back somewhat to the rationalization part of like this cannot possibly be actually happening. Maybe it is The Haunted Mesa by Louis L'Amour.
Oh, nice.
It is simultaneously a mystery, a horror story, and a science fiction story. Has anybody here read it?
Yeah, a long time ago. I
don't
read
believe
just
I have.
about everything by Louis L'Amour at one point. My grandpa, who just passed away, was a massive Louis L'Amour fan, and just was like throwing boxes full of books by him over the wall to me. You know what I mean? Oh man, I'm gonna have to go reread that one now.
Yeah, he gets into the Anasazi and a bunch of Navajo legend, and even getting into the Popol Vuh, the Mayan sacred book.
Interesting.
You read this for the Lost, didn't you?
What's that?
You read this for the Lost, didn't you?
I did not reread it for the Lost, no. But I have read it.
I remember you saying that you were going to try and incorporate more elements from the Anasazi.
I haven't gotten to it yet. That'll have to be in the second series. But yeah, the main character is a regular modern late 20th century dude who's doesn't believe any of this stuff can actually be happening, even when his dog disappears through a gateway in Akiva up on this, and he just gets steadily drawn into it. And it's not necessarily the spookiest story, but it's probably the spookiest story that L'Amour ever wrote.
Yeah.
He had a certain fascination with some of these things too. It came out more than once.
I just looked it up. That Indian film I was talking about is called Tumbad, Tumbad. I don't know if it'll focus on there, but
there we go.
It's on Amazon Prime, so not a bad movie. It's highly rated, but
that's because they destroyed all the 1-star reviews.
Well, I think what it is, they just got their brigade of Indian raiders to come and try to.
They're almost as bad as the K-pop stands.
It's like when these the Indian supergroup was battling with PewDiePie for YouTube supremacy.
Oh yeah.
Have I read Joe? Oh, I think the Drive-In isn't the Drive-In a series of short stories. I'm a huge fan of Joe Lansdale. Giant fan. He's actually one of the guys that that told me and taught me one of the most, for me anyway, one of my most, what I consider my most valuable lessons when writing horror. And that's, if you're writing horror, especially long fiction, horror without hope is pointless. And he was the one that taught me that and told me that. And I'll never forget that. Joe Lansdale's amazing. He's an amazing author. I can't say enough good things about him. The two horror authors I almost always talk about are Joe Lansdale and Robert McCammon. Robert McCammon has the book that I love to talk to people about for Robert McCammon, and it's kind of a little bit of what we've just been talking about. It's called Speaks the Nightbird, and it takes place in like 1699 on the East Coast, kind of colonies era. And the idea is the main character,
Salem chic.
Yeah, just right after Salem, and that's what the idea of the first book is it's right after the hysteria of Salem, which was 1692, and he goes to the main character is an assistant to a magistrate, and they go to this little town where a woman has been accused of witchcraft, and so they're going there to put her on trial and evaluate her. And the hysteria involved that was alive and well during the whole Salem witch trials time is so palpable in this book. And the idea of what is supernatural and what is superstition, that line. And one of the things that I like about it, and for people who want to write this sort of stuff, think about the period in which you're placing your story. If it's modern day, like, supernatural and superstition, there's pretty hard lines between those in current day. But if you go back far enough, we're talking, books like this, 1699, that's when this takes place. Supernatural and superstition are the same freaking thing. Or you look back at one of my favorite series, Bernard Cornwell, the Saxon Tales. Just stellar books, but so much superstition versus supernatural versus religion, that the mashing and the collisions of all those things is so good in those books. Those aren't horror books, but there are so many good horror tropes in them that Bernard Cornwell used. I mean, Bernard Cornwell's a freaking master, but I mean, gosh, so many of these things are so fun. And that's why, like, right at the top of this podcast, I was saying, horror is such a good tool. Like, we can do whatever we want with it. We can put in anything we want. And that's what's so awesome about it.
I have a question about that, though.
Sure.
Because, so you've written historical horror. You've also written modern day horror. Obviously, with modern day horror, we have these cell phones and we're constantly in touch and connected with other people, which is why, like, a horror movie makers hate the modern day now, because it's like you can't just be trapped in the house anymore. You can just be calling up 911 like on the minute, every minute, until somebody comes and gets you.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, it was a lot easier in the 80s and 90s, where you could actually cut people off from the outside world and isolate them.
And going on top of that, like, some horror tropes, the traditional horror tropes, don't work that well in the modern world. Like the secluded little town with a dark secret and everything is weird, like your shadow over Innsmouth, right?
Yeah, DC is not that secluded. So.
Well, like these, like, I remember looking at Google Maps at one point, and even one of the little like polygamous towns from the fundamentalist LDS church in either southern Utah or northern Nevada, maybe northern Arizona, somewhere down there out in the desert. I was looking at the map. There's, like, the highway goes through there, and there's an internet cafe in town or a coffee place, and obviously they have cell phone service. So you don't really get your Innsmouthers hiding in plain sight like that so much.
Yeah. Children of the Corn would be entirely shot on World Star Hip Hop, just be like, look at these stupid kids. But so obviously one remedy to the modern day and our interconnectedness would be the supernatural element, because now the rules are just completely out the window.
Yeah.
What are some other techniques that you would use to mitigate that lack of isolating feature and and keep up the sense of dread?
Well, I mean, I think you can introduce factors that formulate a sense of isolation. When I wrote Residue, I didn't base that book in a real town. I just made up a town out in the middle of the frickin' redwoods, and I looked for a specific area on the map that was just that. It was far away from highways. It was far away from things. And it's a very small town. It's actually based on a little town I grew up in Colorado called Salida. I just kind of transplanted that to the redwoods for a very specific reason. But there's an evil corporation in town that can control transmission of data.
Google.
And so there are different ways. Google. there are different ways to where you can deal with that sort of thing. Supernatural, gosh, once you have supernatural elements, you can kind of get away with whatever you want.
I talked about this with my wife a few times, and one of the ideas she suggested that you can do is more of a like hiding in plain sight type thing. It's not the secluded town like Innsmouth where everybody looks like he's half a fish person. It's places that are in, like your normal, like a normal town or a normal somewhere, but it's just a little off somehow. Like this community is isolated from the outside world, not physically, but by their own choice. They keep to themselves. And there are places where you could have things happen and not have authorities around too, like any one of the urban wastelands, in this country where like the cops may not respond even if you do get a hold of them. So
well, and that's a good point, Mike. Like that's actually one of my big pet peeves. When let's see. Oh yeah. Set during a disaster is a great way. I mean that's the easy way, right? But there's this like, I don't know, trope or whatever, or it's just bad research. And when I used to do a bunch of alpha reading for bigger authors, they would inevitably have scenes where like there's this cop presence in this small area, small town, and they had like this police department of like 20 or 30 guys. And I'm like, man, police departments in rural areas, it's like 1.5 dudes.
I live in a town of maybe 1,300, and I think our police department has 3 people.
Yeah.
There's the county sheriff too, and the next town's 15 miles away. So
well, and they cover such a massive geographical area that there's no way, even if you had them on speed dial, there's no way they could show up, right? There's no way they could be there on time. Yeah, exactly. And so if you can handle that sort of thing, that works. The show, there was a show on Netflix called Midnight Mass. And the idea there was they were on a little island, just kind of off the coast, that only had a ferry that ran at certain times. And if you shut down that ferry, then what? Like, no one's coming to save you. And there was one cop. And he didn't even carry a gun, which was my biggest complaint about that show. It was idiotic. I'm like, no, come on, this isn't.
Or that anybody else freaking carry a gun.
Yeah, I'm like, come on, this is. I can tell what politics are happening here, but other than that show is actually really good, and it touched on a lot of the religious discussions that we were having earlier in a very cool way. But yeah, I mean, gosh. There's so many little tricks you can do when it comes to that sort of thing.
And you could always use, if nothing else, supernatural signal jamming,
Yeah.
The psychic.
That's what I'm saying. It's like the rules just go completely out the window. Like no matter who they call, it's the voice of the demon on the other side just mocking them the entire time. And then I think another trick that you could do is possibly the paranoia aspect, where it's like, yeah, I can call people, but I don't trust any of them. They could all be involved. That would let you.
They actually did the bit with the phone. I can't remember the name of the film. It was with Anthony Hopkins. He was an Italian priest doing an exorcism.
That's The Right.
Yeah, and like the victim's like father called him on the phone, and his father had already died. And you can use that. You can postulate that. If these otherworldly forces can operate in the physical world, then they can mess with your electronics too.
Yeah, I want to say The Right is a pseudo underrated movie, because the latter half of the film is edited in a way where it is kind of confusing. So like when people cite that as a flaw, it's like, yeah, you're right. But as a movie overall, I think it is kind of underrated.
Yeah, and there are. If you get into the realm of ghost stories and such, there are stories of a supernatural effect on electronics, particularly the EVP
there's a thing where they drain the batteries of everything. Like that's, I mean,
Yeah.
my ex used to love watching this one ghost hunting show, and that was always a thing they talked about. But you know, there's like I think there was a pedantic XKCD comic about, well, you know, ghost sightings have gone way down since everyone started carrying a camera around. I'm like, there are a million ghost pictures and videos on the internet. Do you believe any of them? Well, that's the
They're all
problem.
on Animal Planet for some reason.
It's just there's so many fakes out there that nobody's going to believe a real one anyway, you know. And that's something you can work around if you have a modern setting. You don't have to let that cut you off. You just got to be a little bit clever about it. Oh, hey,
Yeah.
Pete, what is your favorite horror genres? We
Well, definitely like Coop, the supernatural sort of to some extent the more suspenseful sort of stuff. To some extent, the monster sort of stories, going back to a lot of the old folklore sort of story stuff, the kind of stuff that I've generally tried to draw on for a lot of mine. The comment earlier on, almost a couple hours now, about make vampires predatory again. Like vampires are supposed to be monsters, not this tragic romantic figure. No, it is a monster.
Well, all right, Pete. What if, say, I know nobody's done this yet, but what if a recon platoon of Marines went up against a vampire? How would he act?
You know, it's a really good book that it's a historical piece. It's a book called 12 by an author named Jasper Kent. And it's during the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. And it's about the Russians are trying to stall the army's march in, right? And they enlist the help of these saboteurs. And you, the reader, understand within like a couple pages what's going on. But they don't, because they're not embroiled in the horror stuff like we are, but they're vampires. And it's this 5-book series. It's extremely good. And it goes back with the fighting, these soldiers end up fighting some of these vampires and all that stuff. And that was really interesting. That was like a historical take on your question to Pete. Now, I think there'd be much more gunfire with Pete involved.
I've already seen it.
Much more gunfire and
Shadow and Crows.
explosives.
Check it out.
There's sort of been a deconstruction of so many of the old monsters over the years that I like to go back to the roots, to where it's like, no, these were actual things that you should be afraid of. I brought dragons, for instance. I brought a dragon into the Lost with book 4, and it's a monster, and it's more than that. It's one of these ancient evils that is going to try and get inside your head before it even decides to snap it off. But you get into some of the what's that, Mike?
So I'm kind of tired of dragons. Number one, that are actually technically wyverns because they don't have front arms, and 2 are just big, dumb, fire-breathing animals. It's been done. They've already done the realistic dragons to death. Like, let's go back to having like fantastical dragons if you're going to have dragons.
So the reason everybody has like jumped on the wyvern physiology is because that's the closest. A lot of people have tried to make it like a realistic creature, and most vertebrate creatures like a dragon would be are 4-limbed. They don't have. Once you start getting into 6, now you're talking about like insects and things like that. So that's why they incorporate the wings into the front limbs.
You're saying it's funny that they can breathe fire, but not being a hexapod is the line. That's.
You will not talk shit about the documentary that is Reign of Fire, okay?
I got to give them credit. They didn't do another zombie apocalypse film. They did a dragon apocalypse film, and it was
No.
stupid, but it was great.
The only thing I'm mad about from that movie is that all the posters promised us like Apache helicopters versus dragons, and we didn't get it.
We didn't have the budget for it.
No, I was really hoping for a mini series instead of a movie.
Yeah.
That'd have been awesome.
Oh, there were so many good movie ideas that should have waited until now, where you have the streaming long format sort of thing is popular. That just instead you got it's like we have so many ideas and we're going to throw them all into a 90-minute movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea of, and I've in the Jed Horn series, I called you had the demons of the abyss, and then you had the other world, which was the world that was just out of sight, and it was simultaneously malevolent and just dangerous, because again that's going back to the old. So a lot of the old stories in Celtic and Germanic mythology, where you had the fair folk, and you called them fair just because you wanted to flatter them, so they didn't decide to take inimical notice of you.
Yeah. So they didn't steal your children and eat them.
Yes, and leave something worse in their place.
Yep.
And in fact, I've borrowed heavily from a lot of that mythology for the Lost, to the point that there are Dullahans in the Lost now. And for those who aren't familiar, the Dullahan is an Irish fairy that is the headless horseman, except this headless horseman has a whip made out of a human spine.
Yeah.
That's metal.
And he will, if he calls your name, guess what's going to happen to you? You're not going to live for very long.
Yeah, it's very Wild Hunty.
Yeah.
Nice. I think for me, I enjoy a good monster movie. I've seen a lot of bad monster movies. I've seen a lot of bad movies, period. Occasionally you see a monster movie that's good. I mean, like good on all accounts, not just awesome, but has terrible special effects, or awesome because it's so bad. You do see a good one. Like Predator is a good monster movie, But as far as what really things that like horror that really kind of scares me, it really kind of gives me the creeps. It's stuff that deals with the supernatural, like ghosts, especially, because it's something that, like, there's with a story, like a good haunting story, there's a sort of a tragic aspect to it, because this is somebody's depths of despair or anger or loss, and they can't let it go. And there's something that's kind of eerie about it, because it's in your normal, familiar world. Like the walls of reality are not collapsing around you, but there's this thing that shouldn't be there by your understanding of the world. And it's also something you can't just fight off with, by physical means. As far as like movies that cover this, like I haven't actually read a lot of horror books. So I can't really comment on that. I remember reading a book called The 13th Hour, like a series of like children's horror stories when I was a kid. And it's the one where this face materialized in the room and stole your breath. That scared the crap out of me when I was a kid.
Yeah. I remember that one.
Didn't even have room for ghosts. Was it Goosebumps? That was the.
No, I never read any of those. But
Oh, come on, everybody read Goosebumps back then.
Everybody's read it.
It was Goosebumps while you were in school, because they didn't care if you were just reading a book, and then it was Are You Afraid of the Dark?
I did watch
Nick,
of course.
Scary stories to read in the dark.
Yep.
Yep, that too. That was a good one too. But somebody in the comments a while back mentioned a Japanese movie, The Grudge. I've seen that movie so many times. When I first saw it, that movie scared the shit out of me. I slept with the lights on for a month. It gave me, put it out there. I'm admitting it, right? That movie gave me freaking nightmares.
I never took a shower again.
There was just something so unsettling about this malevolent force just appearing, 6 inches from your face. And that sound, the death rattle they did of the ghost. I was in a hotel in Utah, in 2005. I was walking down the stairwell and the door like creaked and rattled like that as it was sliding closed because I had one of those, pneumatic pistons on it. Like all the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up.
You were already speed reloading your revolver.
Right?
Huh?
It was, yeah. So I thought
Which meant he drew his second one.
I thought that was a pretty good ghost movie. I liked The Woman in Black too. It was a little heavy on the jump scares, but what I kind of liked about it is that everything wasn't a jump scare though. There were parts where something mundane was going on in the foreground, and you'd catch glimpse of something in the background out of sorts, and it was just it kept that tension going because you never knew when something was going to pop up. It didn't just beat you over the head with it. The sequel was kind of, I don't know if ghost movies really work with sequels. It was all right, but it wasn't as good as the first one.
Really? You're not looking forward to Insidious 5 or whatever?
I don't think I've seen it.
I have unfortunately seen at least part of one of the Insidious movies, and that is probably about half an hour to an hour that I'll never get back.
But so those are like probably some of my actual favorite. I mean, I like Lovecraftian stuff in theory. I mean, I've read some actual Lovecraft. I think Lovecraft gets a little overdone these days in certain quarters. Not in film. You don't really see a lot of Lovecraftian film. It's hard. I think it's just hard to film. It's what was that movie with Sam Neill where he
Jurassic Park? No, Event Horizon.
Mouth of Madness.
Yes, Into the Mouth of Madness. That was a good Jurassic Park. That was a good example of Lovecraftian horror done pretty well.
Sam Neill, The Hunt for Red October. How
With
is that?
with the most pretentious sounding horror author name ever, Sutter Kane. That guy in his black trench coat and his stupid haircut being so full of himself, I can totally see that happening. Look, I know a lot of writers. Okay. Yeah. There's a certain threshold where you make enough money where you start to get disconnected from reality. Nobody will tell you when you're being cringe anymore.
Yeah, then you just real life cosplay every bad thing that you've ever seen.
Right.
Well, no, then you're just Stephen King.
Nah, that dude just, for whatever reason, okay, so back in when it was like 2004 or 5, when he gets hit by a car in Maine and almost dies, right? And I'm thinking, you're Stephen King. Why are you walking along like isolated highways in Maine? And then I thought, well, because you're Stephen King.
Yeah.
That's also probably why they drove into him.
Oh, gosh.
Turns out it was just his neighbor. He's like, you insufferable little prick.
You keep writing bad endings, F you, Stephen King.
Well, it's Stephen King, I think, maybe just have peaked a good while ago and is just continuing on because he's Stephen King.
Yeah. And then the price of cocaine went up.
That too.
Inflation's real.
And this is, setting aside completely his various meltdowns on Twitter and whatever else.
Okay.
Oh, those are the scariest stuff he's ever written, because you're reading it and you're like, oh man, somebody like this exists.
So,
but what about the horror cinematic masterpiece of Manos, The Hands of Fate?
You know what? Something like Manos could have been scary.
Yeah, I've thought about that.
They had an idea.
I feel like if you had
a budget or competent filmmakers or like a camera that could record sound, the whole movie had to be overdubbed, and that was not uncommon in low budget movies all through even into the 70s. Like,
welcome to the stream, Steve.
Steve's like, no, that movie is unsavable. What are you talking about?
It's not unsavable.
What is happening?
Would you come into our house and besmirch Torgo?
Steve's like, it's like, don't even mention Manos. Signs is the real scary.
Oh gosh. Oh.
The thing that pissed me off about Signs is it did have like competent horror elements to it, but the story behind it is just the dumbest thing ever.
I'm like, what did so what happened when the aliens got to like Florida? Did they just melt?
So M. Night Shyamalan is a guy who he has talent, but he also sniffs his own farts a lot, I think. Like really gets up in there. Like I remember, I don't remember what movie I was seeing, but I remember a trailer for Devil came on, the one that was in an elevator. Because obviously M. Night Shyamalan would make a movie where it's in an elevator, right? And
that's how he pitched the idea. The elevator pitch. He's just like, it's a movie like right now.
Somebody in the front row of the theater yelled out, "There's a twist! It's not actually an elevator!" And everybody laughed. And that's pretty much how everyone considers M. Night Shyamalan. Yeah. The village would have been more interesting if it really would have been a colonial era village surrounded by monsters.
Absolutely.
Instead, it was just some rich guy LARPing, and it just like this is dumb. This isn't scary anymore. It's just child abuse.
Yeah, there's a reason why the robot chicken version of M. Night Shyamalan saying "What a twist" has become such a meme.
Yeah, I was waiting for the twist in The Last Airbender, and it just never came. Instead, it just was like one of the worst movie experiences of my life.
That was the twist.
That was the twist.
It's like what the fuck?
You were expecting a twist. There is none. What a twist!
No, you know what's hilarious though is that like everybody gets mad at M. Night Shyamalan for that the race bending, as they called it in that movie, because you like changed the races of all the people from the fucking cartoon. But they're like, oh, you made the bad guys Indian. What they don't get is that this guy was a total weeb for that show. Like he loved that show. He would watch it with his family and all that stuff. And so he changed it so that his favorite character would be the same race as him. So it was like this massive self-insert effort for him. But everybody's feel like, oh, he whitewashed it and he made the Indians the evil guys. It's like, yeah, because he liked them the best.
I think, horror it's not unique in this way, but it kind of stands out as a genre in that there have been a lot more bad attempts put out there than there have been good attempts, I think.
Well, and that's like, it's like classic, humor, right?
Classic fodder for B movies too, which is where a lot of it comes from. So,
but I think it's because you can do more with less.
Yeah.
I mean, the horror B movies came about because they didn't have the budget for anything else. Same with like noir, which kind of were the horror of their time.
They're very linked, very, very linked.
Yeah. And so it's you do more with less, especially in the cinematic side. It's because I don't know enough about writing books to say that like some genres of books cost less to make than others. So
I don't worry about it.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say for the cinematic side of it, all because now everything's dark, right? So you don't have to spend as much on lighting and blocking and these large, grandiose sets. You can do everything on a smaller scale. They start including the isolation aspect because they don't have enough actors, And so, like noir and horror were the B movies because they were the low budget movies. And so, obviously, when you're working with a low budget, everybody's going to understand that it's like, yeah, not everything's going to be a winner and you're going to get more bad attempts than good attempts. But at the same time, because they didn't have the budget, they didn't have the scale that they might have wanted, all of their efforts had to be focused on the story and the execution and the acting. Basically, it was you have to do more with less. And because it's a B movie, it's generally you trying to break into the industry. So that was their audition tape. That's their shot. And that was the chance that they were going to take. And they had to do as well as they could with as little as they could. So that's where you get a lot of the classics. So.
Well, and to even go a little bit more than that too, it's there, just like with comedy, horror and comedy have so many more failures than they do successes. And that's because both those things are very subjective. What's funny to a lot of people, what's scary to a lot of people is very different from person to person. I was talking about this on, what show was it? It was another podcast I was on. And we were talking about why certain things like Alien or The Thing or Jaws or whatever, why they've endured so long, where other movies have failed, and that's because they and and you can find similar examples amongst comedy, why certain movies are still funny no matter what, and I think it's because they appeal to a more primal sense of fear or a more primal sense of humor, and those successes that stick out, they have that in common. The fears of, like, for horror, like the fears of the unknown, the fears of loss, the fear of the dark because of what's in the dark, the unknown again. Like all those things go really, really well together, and they last, and they appeal to just about everybody on a very deep level. There's still that little lizard brain part of us that's like, I don't know how I feel about going through that abandoned building tonight.
Like I
Not
said,
feeling it.
most people aren't scared of a creepy old building because they're worried about like a crazy homeless guy in there.
No, no.
That's a possibility, but that's a possibility you can probably deal with, you know.
No, I'm more worried about what my imagination is telling me is in there.
Yeah.
And Coop's talking about the B movie aspect. I don't know if any of you have seen any of the. I'm getting into a little bit older sort of internet stuff. Some of the YouTube series surrounding the Slender Man.
Oh yeah.
One that immediately comes to mind, I think, was Everyman Hybrid, which started out as just this really kind of low budget guys who didn't really know what they were doing, trying to show trying to do
It was
their
amateur filmmaking. Yeah.
about how to get fit, but you start seeing just glimpses of this figure in the background, and then slowly they build it up and build it up. But it didn't take very much.
I think that's an effective tool for horror in several different mediums too. And when things are normal and mundane, but like we were talking about before, there's a sense of wrongness. There's something out of place, and it's maybe easier to do in film than it is in books because you can just show something. You can give the reader a visual or the viewer a visual cue. It's maybe a little bit harder to articulate in writing, but like everything looks normal, everything seems normal, but something is still wrong. And I think that's powerful because everybody has experienced that. Everybody's woke. Like if you've ever been to basic training in the armed forces, and you were out in the field and couldn't suddenly you reached around and your weapon wasn't there. You know that feeling of something wrong, right? Yeah, it's
or
Or if you're 3'6" and everybody's like,
or I mean, I know every one of you guys has experienced this too, like I have, where you're walking around in a big crowd and a person walks by you and they just feel wrong.
yeah.
There's something wrong. It's something the way they're holding themselves, maybe the way their eyes are moving weird or something like that. And that's when you start kind of like doing that check. You're like, okay, I'm carrying appendix today, right? Like, you're that like we've all had that experience. I had that experience recently at a con down in Dallas. Guy walks by and me and another guy I was with, we were in a conversation. We both just stopped. We both kind of looked at the guy and then looked at each other and went,
Well, I for one am shocked that such people would be in attendance at a sci-fi fantasy convention.
That's true.
Shocked. Okay, not that.
But yeah, I think you're right though. Like everybody's experienced that. They've seen somebody that just gave them a bad vibe,
Yeah.
and it leaves a lot of room for the imagination though.
Yep.
It could be. You tell yourself it's more than likely it's just some little. Most likely it's nothing. It's just your imagination. Second most, there's like some little visual cue that you're not quite processing that you still notice. It's just telling you that something's off.
they're just totally not bussing, dude.
As the kids say, yes. No cap. Or maybe there is a cap. I don't know how that works. But
I don't know. I heard it somewhere. I still don't know what it means.
Well, the power of the imagination to conjure threats And in some ways, that's just kind of it. I think it's a survival mechanism to keep you from like land nav in the middle of the woods by yourself at night. And
I think it's very much an evolutionary response to keep you from acting like a horror movie protagonist. You know, like, oh, there's this menacing old structure. Why don't I go in and poke around and let my guard down?
Let's split up.
but you'd be amazed how fast the wind starts to sound like voices when you're on the third hour after sunset out in the woods, or just even in the grassland sometimes.
It may have been the sleep. It may have been the sleep deprivation, but like there's only so many night patrols and night land navs through a swamp that's reclaimed an old village in Camp Lejeune before everybody's like, dude, I fucking hear the ghost. I hear it. I hear it.
Well, you guys have all been through like hyper dense thick fog, right? Like,
yeah,
the fog where like you're in a car, right? You can see maybe 3 feet in front of you. And as the fog goes by, it's not you're passing through the fog. It's that the fog is like rubbing against your car and going by it. It's almost like it's like feeling your car to see if there's a way in, right?
Yep.
Like it doesn't take much imagination to look at that and start going, nope. I'm gonna go sit in my recliner tonight with the lights on.
Yeah, see, that would have been so much better than just, oh man, there's giant arthropods hidden in the mist. Everybody freak out in the convenience store.
Yeah.
Somebody's gonna go act like this is all like it's a sign from God. That's why there's a big, armored tentacle coming in grabbing people, because that is obvious.
Don't get me wrong, I would be concerned if there were these giant creatures in the mist.
Yes.
But the fog being sentient and trying to creep its way into my enclosed space, that goes back to the primal fear of A, something's off, and B, to say it flippantly, like my bubble is being violated.
Yeah.
It was what you were saying with the Grudge, where it's like you just wake up and there's this thing 6 inches from your face. It's that proximity of the unknown to you that is
However, we
dread
all know
fear.
It's a known fact that the most threatening and terrifying thing that you might find in fog is ghost pirates. So
for sure. I mean, that goes unsaid.
But they're politely first. So
that's where you pull out the pirate code and just go parlay. I know you're referencing a different movie, but I just had to do
it. It still applies.
It's more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
Man, remember the one time where those movies were good?
Yeah.
And by movies, I mean the one movie.
The one movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's, gosh, I was thinking about all that and all of that isolation, that unknown, I think that's why, going back to a little bit of Joe Lansdale, you see that whole Weird West thing, which I really, really like. The idea that those two things occupy some of the same space, that frontier, that unknown, isolation, and all that. Yeah, when you start talking about that sparked that whole thought in my head.
I think
the frontier part is great because everything is normal is deadly and trying to kill you.
Yeah.
So now you have the supernatural aspect on top of it.
And I think the American West is just a good setting for horror in a lot of ways, because you have, you have a lot of meeting of different worlds here. You have civilization encroaching on the frontier. You have old world, beliefs and superstitions giving way to industry and science and modernization. You have, the natives that are defeated and have their own legends, and they were hostile to, and there's a lot you can work with there, and I think it's kind of almost underutilized, I want to say.
Oh, it's totally underutilized.
Probably a lot more spook stories out of the Old West that didn't necessarily even get written down and kind of got eclipsed by the genre of the Western.
Yeah.
Which, don't get me wrong, I'm still fleshing out. I found out my Louis L'Amour collection was shorter than I thought it was, so I'm still fleshing that out. But
You only had 170 of his novels.
yeah, something like that.
Man was
But
prolific.
the as great as the Western is as a genre, there was a I think there was a lot more going on behind just that genre, and L'Amour touched on that a few times, most notably in like the Haunted Mesa, though that was set in a more modern setting. But you had those Indian beliefs and rituals and such, and just the fact of and they had a whole plethora of monsters that I may have drawn on a few times in Jedhorn.
And, and there is some like genuinely scary stuff from Native American folklore too. Like their myths and legends. There was like some good stuff to draw on there.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, it's not just like the Plains Indians or the Forest Indians. Like the Eskimo and Inuit had some pretty scary stuff going on up north too. And you want to talk about a hostile environment just to add problems to, the frozen north is one of it. And unfortunately, the only foray into that we have is 30 Days of Night, which is a great concept. They clearly had never been to Barrow, Alaska, though.
The Terror.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Mike. Is that the Terror does a pretty good job, but that's Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons could do what he wants.
And believe me, he has.
He had. I mean, the guy's like, you know what? I'm going to write some of the best horror novels ever today, and then the next day he's like, how about science fiction instead? Like, whatever, jerk.
Stupid, sexy Sanders.
Actually, one of my favorite horror novels is by him. And that's Carrying Comfort, which is the psychic vampires story that he wrote. That book is excellent.
Science
really
fiction,
messed up.
Science fiction is another genre that can work well with horror.
Oh yeah,
it's been.
I never would have guessed.
It's been done a lot. It's been done poorly a lot, but there's a lot to work. I think one of my favorite forays into that is a couple of anthology books. It's about Lovecraft taking horror in space. I'm just blanking on the title now.
Are you talking about Space Eldritch?
Yeah, Space Eldritch 1 and 2.
Yeah. That's where my space janitor story is. It's in the second one.
There's some stories in there that I didn't hit me as hard, but there are some that are very memorable in there too.
Mike, you said earlier that you hadn't written any horror, but you definitely touched on it a couple times in Her Brother's Keeper.
Yeah.
Anytime you can get the space artifacts, right?
Yeah, that was obviously, not going to surprise anyone that was kind of heavily inspired by Event Horizon, which I still think is one of the best horror movies ever made.
Interesting.
There is something to me about just finding a ghost ship, and this has happened in the real world many times, but where you have no idea what happened. Like, it's just, you don't have any information. It's just this massive ship that's been abandoned and the crew is gone. And I think it's frightening because it leaves a lot to the imagination. And that's why the real instances of ghost ships are, even though the causes are almost certainly mundane, it's very, it sticks with people. That survives as a trope for a reason.
That reminds me, and I cannot remember the name of it now. Read it years and years and years ago. But it was a ghost ship story where there was an experiment back in the 50s to basically cloak the
Philadelphia experiment.
What's that?
Talk about the Philadelphia experiment.
No. They were basically trying to cloak a destroyer, and it worked and it disappeared, but it showed up like 30 years later, apparently unmanned. and it's been too long for me to remember too much of it, but I know it freaked me the hell out. And it was the same author wrote another one about a ghost ship submarine that in the Pacific.
Oh, I know the submarine one. I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah.
Trying
I
to
don't
see
know.
if I
I
can
don't
find
have
it.
them here. They were. I think it was at my folks' house and probably still there. But yeah, that ghost ship, like, where has it been and what happened to all the people on it?
Yeah. And that's
But
also what made Event Horizon so good, you
Yeah.
know.
But it's not even just the ship aspect, because that was one of the great parts of the thing, and one of the biggest failings of the sequel prequel that they did was they come across the Swedes or the Nords, whatever,
Nords.
their camp, and obviously shit went wrong, but they have no idea what it was. Um, and then they start seeing all this stuff happen to them, and that's what freaks them out. Well, that and the weird dog monster. But in the sequel, it's like, first off, you already know how each person dies because they go through it in the first one. But it's like there's no you basically already, that's kind of the problem with prequels, is you already know what happens with those, with everybody involved. And so, like, but yeah, it goes back to, that's the appeal of like an abandoned town or abandoned ship or a ghost ship or something like that. Is it's like you obviously know something happened, but you don't know what. And so there's that mystery aspect on top of all the dangers that would come with the horror aspect.
I've heard it said that you can, like, how long something has been abandoned, it can be scary either way. But there is a certain uniqueness that comes if you find something that's obviously been recently abandoned and you don't know why. Because in that case, like, whatever happened could still be an immediate threat to you. And I think that can add an edge of tension to it. Like, you come across something where it hasn't been lost for centuries, it's been lost for like a few days.
Well, it's like Dead Space, right? You know, if
Yeah,
you talk about video games, right? Like Dead Space or
I never
stuff
actually,
like that.
I never actually played Dead Space, but yeah, I guess.
Yeah, very much that.
System
It's
Shock.
like,
Yep, System Shock is
that
one
was
that comes to mind.
that was when I played too. So,
Or Bioshock.
Yeah.
Or even like in a
Spiritual
sci-fi,
sequel.
like a space opera setting, like, it's the old trope of, you find the ruins of the ancient civilization that was wiped out. Well, what if you find the ruins of a civilization that was wiped out like 10 years before you got there? So whatever did it is still around. That's kind of just makes it kind of a little bit of a different story there.
Plus, they're still the ancient civilization. Like, they lasted for thousands of years until last week.
Yeah, yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Nick and Jason really started to lean into that with Imperator, going back into the Savage Wars, when things really start to get creepy. Because it was, the Galaxy's Edge was just kind of, it was Star Wars, not Star Wars.
Yeah.
Up until then. And then they kind of started to pull back the curtain on, there's some really weird, creepy stuff going on out there in the black. They've
cool.
built on that since then, but
that's cool. I
There's,
haven't got to that one yet.
I think a kind of a very interesting to me anyway. So obviously that's all that matters. And like, I guess you'd call it like a subgenre of horror. And it's kind of been a thing on YouTube, not so much in like movies or whatever. A little bit in movies, but is like there's this new thing going around called analog horror, right? It's where you have the lost videotape that you find. And I guess it started in film, like the Blair Witch Project started that.
The found footage stuff.
Found footage.
VHS too.
I think a lot of it, of the analog horror stuff today, comes from the fact that, I hate to say this, but I'm getting old, and I think the Zoomers like a VHS tape or a broadcast television is
It's
just
an ancient artifact.
it's as creepy and removed from them as you or I looking at some sepia toned photo from the 1870s. You know,
There's a series about that on Netflix called Archive 81. That's very Lovecraftian in the cult sense. That deals about that. It's about a guy who's been asked to restore a bunch of old tapes, old videotapes.
and I've even seen ones where they overdo it and they mix their genres. Like there was a little indie horror game out there called No Players Online, where you're like playing an old shooter game and there's nobody else on the map, but then there's another entity in there. But it's this low poly like Quake level 3D environment, but there's also like tracking lines on it. Like it's on a like you guys know that those games didn't run on tapes, right? Like they were digital. You had internet and everything.
If they wanted to do the real throwback, everything would be like pre-rendered except for your character.
It was
There you go.
It was funny. It's like some SCP game I saw takes place in like 2006, and there's like
so far ago.
There's like computers
back in the dark ages.
There's computers with big CRT monitors, and they have flip phones, and there's a tape recorder. I'm like, guys, I had Wi-Fi on my laptop in college in 2001. Okay, this stuff isn't. Come on now.
Yeah, not everybody was rich like you, Mike.
Gosh, some of us still had our brick phones.
I'm going to share a link to one of the channels that I found that does that. If you share that in the chat, people might find that interesting.
So the video games are an interesting aspect because now the horror elements need to be interactive, right? It's like you can't. Well, I guess you can if you're just creatively bankrupt, but you can't like railroad the character or the player into every horror element. Like a lot of it has to be ambient. A lot of it has to be their interaction with the game is what draws out these horror elements. And Pete, there's this pseudo online game where the mechanics are pretty interesting, but it is an old west styled horror sort of shooter, where it's basically it's called the Hunt Showdown. Where
I've heard of that one.
You and it's kind of co-op where you guys like are tracking down these like creepy monster sort of things, and you're delving in with the supernatural, but you're still using like period accurate or pseudo accurate firearms, and a lot of it is you go in there with what you have, so it's like you need to be very sparing with your ammo and resources and things like that.
You start off with a single shot break action shotgun and one thing, or like a Nagant revolver equivalent that's loads from a loading gate.
Yeah, and the monsters don't go down with one shot, so you need to. It's like half Resident Evil, half first person shooter, and half Mousetrap. Like the way that you actually have to set everything up to get it, and the whole thing is that you're like this experienced supernatural bounty hunter that like you're going in there to get this creature so that you can collect a bounty on it, but so are other people, and they're jumping into your map and they're fighting you for the bounty and things like that.
I like Showdown. I'm bad at it. I don't play it much, but it's
interesting. But it's interesting because everything is based off of like location on the map. So they even when you're testing out like new weapons that you bought and all that stuff, you get to go in and hear the shots from certain distances, like all the way out to a couple hundred meters, because that matters in the game. It's like you're not going to get a beacon saying like, oh, hey, there's an enemy over here. So you're just going to get the ambient sounds of gunshots, and you're going to have to do range estimation off that. So you might actually like that experience. And the other thing is, like we brought up System Shock and BioShock and all that, and Dead Space, which is kind of the same. They based a lot of stuff off of System Shock.
They did.
Where it's kind of like the noir and B movie horror aspects, where they came to this genre and this conclusion because they didn't want to have to write all these stupid branching dialogues for character interaction with the NPCs.
You
So
don't
there was
really
like,
talk to the NPCs if they're all dead.
yeah, that was their solution. It's like, what if everybody's dead? So whatever information you get from NPCs is all through journal logs and things like that, so that we can dictate the interaction with the other people in this world.
And,
So what if we just killed them all? Okay,
some of this,
that's great. Why are they all dead? Now you have a horror game.
some of that kind of like found log form of storytelling it's been done a lot now in a lot of different games and a lot of your indie, even like your little indie horror games, right? That all the YouTubers like to play. But my favorite sub trope with that is when they're just like notes taped to the wall that you're find and read. Like, so I've decided that if I ever start spiraling into madness or I'm being pursued by a supernatural enemy, I'm going to get like sheets of notebook paper and scribble what's going on down like cryptically and tape it to the wall. So somebody will be able to
drumming in the deep.
Next month's stream, we're gonna bring up the video, and Mike's office is just gonna be papered with notes.
But Mike's still going to be there, so it's going to look like Charlie from It's Always Sunny with the strings over the weird note. Guys, you don't understand. I found him.
Yeah.
But it just goes into. It's interesting because you don't kind of have that aspect with the literary form of horror, where you don't have these budgetary constraints. So it's freeing in that sense, but at the other hand, like you I don't want to say you don't have that innovation, but like there's less constraining factors that force that innovation.
Yeah, there's when it comes to the literary side, like you don't have like what was that video game? Hellblade. Where it's kind of sort of Native American, not really, kind of sort of Norse, but not really, whatever. And the character that you're playing is going crazy, and she's hearing whispers, and the way the audio is presented, especially if you wore headphones, was really interesting. It would feel like they were behind you or to your side, and
it's like the surround creepy sound. It takes advantage of the directional.
Mm-hmm. Or Alien Isolation does that as well. And those audio cues, the ambient sound, all that stuff, it's hard to it can be quite challenging to pull that sort of thing off in the written form.
Right.
Now if you're good at describing and showing all the different senses and stuff, you can be very effective in writing, but it's a very different feeling, I think, than if you're watching or something.
When you're writing it, you can't help but call attention to it.
Yeah.
Because if you're noting it if you're describing it in the writing, it means it has some bearing on the story. If it's like one of those first Everyman Hybrid videos where it just looks like a really kind of amateurish attempt at a fitness video, except as they're panning across the woods, there's an unnaturally tall, thin man in a dark suit standing there that you just catch a glimpse of that quick. You're almost not even sure you saw it, but it was there. You can't really do that on the page. So on the page, it has to be much more deliberate, and there's only, you can't be as subtle as you can be in a visual sort of medium.
Because also you can't, not only because it you have to draw attention to it deliberately, you can't also, like, nobody will let you get away with omniscient narrator anymore, right?
No.
And so you can't describe something that the characters don't see. So that is a limiting factor, especially for horror. That's a big part of like horror movies, is you see something that the characters don't. So you know something they don't. So you feel tension. Well, you can't do that in a book.
So is there a way to get around that by having different POV characters and each of them has that like say, character A, they're in a building, right? And so that you're describing the interior of the building. Let's say it's like a barn or a house or something like that. Character B, who has no idea character A is in there or that anybody's in that building, is outside of the building and they're seeing something sort of like just prowling around it. You know, to them, there's no shock value to character B because they're seeing this from a distance. And they're like, oh man, there's that threat. Good thing I'm this far away from it. But now, in hindsight, the reader now has a sense of danger for character A because they don't know that creature is prowling around.
Yeah, you can.
Can you sort of like do
Oh,
that,
yeah.
or how effective would that be?
Oh yeah, you can always play games with POV in order to, especially if you do third person, you can hide a lot of information from the reader. If it's first person, your character is going to notice what they notice, and so you have to hide information in a different way. Third person, you can kind of play a shell game with your point of view characters in terms of the data that's being presented. And so you can have equally successful horror experiences through both. I feel like the first person narrative gives you a bit more personal, more visceral feel to whatever the experiences are, whereas the third person you can probably get more unique perspectives. If the idea is to always tell the story from the most interesting point of view, then third person gives you the most options in that regard, especially when it comes to horror. So it's just a stylistic choice, at least in my view.
You could even, in that sort of a setup, kind of set it up to where, without necessarily identifying it as such, there's just like a couple paragraphs from the monster's point of view, looking in at the characters. And again, keeping that as uncertain as to what exactly is doing this watching is going to help build that tension.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could really do something with that too, especially if you wrote those scenes like that perspective in just kind of a different style, like it has a different pattern of thinking, a different pattern of it isn't like the reader will like, this is a character, but I don't know if this is a human character, but you don't give anything away because again, what you don't know is the scariest thing.
Heck, you could even write it in a different tense. Like, I mean, when I wrote Residue, the main character, Jack, he's written in first person because I wanted his more immediate visceral responses to the horrors he was seeing. Whereas when the character Alex, who's the mind reader girl that I talked about, her stuff is all written from third person because she's getting all this data is just filtering in through her. And so you could from a monster type story and horror and another type of horror story, I could see easily doing something like that where, the main character, say maybe all the main characters are third person, limited or whatever. No omniscient. That's not in style anymore. But
That's banned.
It's banned.
Pretty much.
Although oddly enough, a lot of old horror and old science fiction is written in an omniscient.
A lot of old books are written in third person
for a lot of those very reasons that we're talking about.
Dune was, I believe, Lord of the Rings was.
Dune was for sure. A lot of old horror is.
It's just considered an archaic style for one reason or another, and I think I understand it because it's very easy to do wrong. It's something that's very easy to.
Almost all of it.
Well, what's interesting is the original Dracula was basically like found footage for books, and it was such archetypal for horror, but it was all through diary logs and news clippings and things like that.
How much of like Lovecraft's work was somebody going through old tomes
tons of it.
It's something. I think it's an old trope, but it works, and it continues on for a reason.
There's one more aspect that I'd kind of like to touch on because we talked about the horror showing up in different genres, and I think we can all sort of agree that 40K in some places has done this extremely well.
Space Hulk.
Eisenhorn, Dan Abnett's
Yep.
Eisenhorn trilogy, did it phenomenally well. I think part of that, and I've tried to kind of bring some of that into some of my stuff too, is actually I remember having this conversation with you, Steve, at one point about so much of modern fantasy. The magic is basically technology. It's plug and play, whereas with the warp and with the sorcery that I tend to depict in some of my work, it is a wild, chaotic, and very destructive force that you can't really control.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have a great deal of potential for horror, I think, with that, particularly that if you have a character, whether it's, if you really want to get dark, make it your point of view character, or another character involved in the story where they're making that reach for something that they shouldn't, meddling with things they shouldn't, and then that leads to everything starting to unravel.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of the genre aspect of that goes back to what Steve was saying, where sword and sorcery is just fantasy with the added weirdness element. And I think a lot of that is because you have the magic that's magic and not technology. There's still this unknown aspect and this esoteric aspect to where anything could happen. You know, you could cast a fireball at somebody or could blow your hand off. You know, like there's that unknown and uncontrollable aspect to magic where it still feels like you're delving into practices that you probably shouldn't. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not the published author here, but like how much of that is kind of driven by the publishing industry, where I've heard it said that, you know, especially back in the 80s and 90s, where they would pitch a fantasy book, and the first question that would come from the publisher or the editor is, all right, what's your magic system?
Yeah.
So now they were kind of being directed to create mechanics for their magic.
I think,
and that's where this delineation between sword and sorcery and fantasy, whether high or low, you know, sort of branched off.
I don't know when exactly or why exactly that started, but I've seen a lot of stuff written about the importance of, you know, hashing out your magic system and how it works and all that. And I'm like, to me, just as a personal thing, I'm not like a big fantasy reader. I have not read very much fantasy at all. So, but to me, when you demystify magic, it kind of loses something. It becomes, you know, it's like, oh, now it's midichlorians instead of the mystical life energy of the universe. You know, it makes it, when you make it mundane and when you make it easy to understand, I think you lose the unknown, sense of unknown, and that makes it harder to do horror with too, because, well, it's just
it's actually Old Man Jenkins.
It's like chemistry at that point. You know, you can predict what's going to happen with these forces just by using it correctly. Well, I like the idea of magic as being something that you're meddling with unearthly forces, and you should do so sparingly for your own good. You know.
And there's also
that even shows up in sci-fi, where say part of the story's appeal is that you've found a bunch of new technology that you don't understand, and it's from a long cut off civilization, Halo. But you know, to the point where it's like, all right, this is practically magic. Yes, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. You know, it's sufficiently advanced technology, but at the end of the day, the way it functions in the story is magic. All that is sort of neutered if by the end of the story they're just like, well, if we reverse the polarities, then we can make it do this and that and the other thing. Where, okay, the previous 300 pages are gutted by that at that point, just because now you can just, you know, change the magnetism and it works exactly the way you want it. Now it works as technology, whereas before it was basically functional magic.
I think that comes down to what the attitude of the story you want to have is. If you have a very, very defined a magic system, then the magic system is going to be the solution to the problems. And the characters are going to look for ways to game said system to their advantage. Everything starts to revolve around it. I mean, that's Brandon Sanderson in a nutshell. In fact, I know that that's exactly how he deals with some of the co-author projects he does. Is he's told his co-authors, like, look, the magic system has to be integral into the solution of all of the problems. Whereas if if the magic is more wild, more untamed, more mysterious, perhaps more violent, and more destructive, as I think all of us have talked about, the magic isn't the solution. The people are the solution. And I think that that definitely appeals to me more. But I kind of like, I kind of like the, the Robert E. Howard stuff, and I kind of like the David Gemmell and that sort of stuff. That's my taste, and that's why Sword and Sorcery really appeals to me. And I think because I like what you said, Mike. I think that the demystification of the magic, for me personally, it's a little boring.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally magic. Are we?
Yeah.
And you're turning
All
it
right,
into
Mike, have you considered it makes for a good RPG system, though?
Now that's true.
I think that's
you do have to
kind of where a lot of it comes into, is people thinking too many steps ahead, where it's like, all right, I'm going to write this great story and it's going to have this badass magic system, because then I can adapt it to either a video game or a tabletop game or something like that.
You also have, a lot of people are inspired by Dungeons and Dragons and other stuff that's already done.
You have that to where people's entire understanding of the genre is formed by role-playing games.
Yep.
And that's their entire frame of reference.
And unfortunately,
for
it's not just the magic system. And I know you've raved about this. It's where it starts gamifying the characters.
Yep.
Where it's like, all right, what role are they? So this guy, he uses a hammer, therefore he's the barbarian or the paladin or something. So he's going to act like every archetypal paladin or barbarian or cleric or whatever that I played in all these role-playing games. Excuse me. Rather than, it's like, hey, this is a character with like an upbringing that dictated how he views life and his experience.
He has an upbringing. He has a culture. He has a history of his people that he draws on.
Yeah. Well, which is weird, because in these role-playing games, people do that to justify like why they can do certain things in the character, but it's all like built around the role that they're playing. Whereas you don't have that limitation in story crafting, yet people keep bringing it over.
It's putting the cart before the horse, really.
Yeah.
It's putting the cart before the horse. And I know there is somewhat of a justification where it's like, hey, if you have a limited runtime or page count and you need to start taking shortcuts because you're trying to fit a bigger story than that in there, you can kind of save time by being like, hey, this is the farm boy who's about to step on the hero's journey. You all know it. I know it. Let's skip that bullshit and get into the meat of the story. There is a place for archetypes and things like that, because it is shorthand to the reader. But if it's just like, let me show you about this game character that I'm pretty fond of, and I'm going to put him in the story so that you can be fond of him too. Yeah. That's where it gets.
There's a difference between archetype and, well, I want this particular class.
Yeah.
I've interrupted you too many times, Steve. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that. I mean, that's literally what Larry and I did at the beginning of Servants of War. We're like, hey, look, here's this farm kid. It's going to be all happy, and he's going to go on a mystic quest with all of his friends, and then we kill everyone.
Yeah. Obi-Wan's a dick.
Like, killed everything except him in the village. And that's not a spoiler, because that's like chapter 1. But, and again, and that's I think that's where horror can be used, where us as authors, where we can use horror to our advantage. We can take some of these tried and true tropes and stuff that we see, like in whether science fiction or fantasy or noir or Western or whatever, and we can say, okay, yeah, but if we inject horror, what does it do to that narrative? How do the stakes increase as we all keep talking about? How do the stakes increase? What does it do to the characters? How does it change how we craft those characters on the back end so that we can show them to you on the page? And that's awesome stuff. That's where the fun is for me personally.
I had an interesting idea just on the discussion of magic systems versus the wild and mystic. What if there is a magic system, but that's the trap?
And then it becomes the actual magic. I was just about to say that. I didn't want to interrupt you.
That's the first taste.
Yeah.
But as you get deeper, it gets worse and wilder, and there's much higher costs. But now you're caught.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, level 1 magic is 2d6, where it's very predictable. But the higher level magic, now you're doing with d20s, basically, right?
So much, Coop.
You're a monster.
So to answer that question of you posed at the beginning of the stream, who's the bigger monster? Is it man or the monster? It's actually Coop.
It's Coop. Yeah.
Well, that's also it goes up to what Steve was just talking about. Is horror might be just for a different genre. Horror might be the wild card.
Yeah.
Okay. Because all right, we're in a fairly typical story. I know the tropes of say fantasy, right? So it's a farm boy. It's Luke Skywalker with a sword rather than a lightsaber. It's Obi-Wan's an old knight rather than an old Jedi knight. Oh, but then everybody dies of the plague, right? And he's stuck, and now you can hear the flaps of dragon wings. That's the horror element. Now everything as a reader that I thought was going to happen isn't going to fucking happen. Now what is? Now there's that.
I think what you touched on there is part of the reason that horror is such a ongoing popular genre and why it's so effective, because you can inject it into pretty much any setting, and it can subvert expectations, and it adds something uncanny, something frightening, into something that otherwise would be kind of mundane, even within the parameters of its own setting.
I agree. It does subvert expectations because The Last Jedi, in my mind, is a horror movie. So.
Not for the reasons we want.
On that note, guys, we're at 3 hours now, so that maybe we should think about wrapping this up.
Yeah, we should probably.
Yeah, I should probably do that sleep thing at some point. I hear it's valuable.
So, Steve, since you're the guest, do you have anything you want to plug?
Some of the usual stuff. I'd really love for everyone to pick up Servants of War by me and Larry. I think that's it's a great fantasy novel and it's a great horror novel, all wrapped up into one. And it's, that whole trench warfare fantasy vibe that it's got going is pretty unique out there at the moment. And then I'd really love for people to go pick up my short story collection called What Hellhounds Dream. And then, of course, hey, listen to mine and Larry's podcast. We do it weekly. We've been doing it for a little over a year now. So there's like 60 something episodes out there where me and Larry sometimes are intelligent and sometimes we just talk about whatever. Sometimes we get guests on so that we actually sound like we know what we're talking about.
But then the audio sounds like it's in a hotel room or something.
That was just recently because it was in a hotel room, literally. But that's okay. Those episodes were awesome.
Let's not forget Larry's internet writing advice voice.
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah. Oh, I feel bad for Jack when he's editing some of these episodes.
Like, tell him not to wear headphones.
Now I kind of feel bad for not listening to Larry's podcast.
I know. How dare you? How dare you?
You've already gotten all the writer advice from him.
That's true. Right. But no, it was cool. when Larry and I were down in Dallas, we had down in Dallas, and then when we were at FanX the next weekend, we had a couple people come up to us that said that they discovered who we were through the podcast, which was a little weird. We're like, what? Okay. Hey, that's great.
Yeah, you need to start wearing that. Be like, yeah, we're the esteemed hosts of Writer Dojo. Also, we have some books, but it's like our things Writer Dojo.
Everyone loves it when you approach them and be like, let me tell you about my podcast.
Oh,
it's the way to win friends.
Oh gosh. But no, so those are the main things. I do have a short story, a Christmas horror short story coming out in December through an anthology. It's called what's that anthology called?
Die Hard, Die Bloodier.
No, the idea is basically it's all the stories had to be where Santa was Spec Ops. So it's called I think it's called Sleigh Bells Ring, SLAY.
Yeah.
But I just wrote Alien or Aliens, but with Santa. So
well, if Santa's going Spec Ops, Reindeer 6 might have been a good title.
Oh, that would have been a really good title.
Yeah.
Ah, dang! Now I want to write that story.
Oh, there you go. You got one for next year too.
Oh man! But no, so I wrote that.
Make it a yearly thing.
Oh, jeez. So yeah, I'm just plugging along with the writing right now, in between the day job stuff. So, but no, it's been good, and I appreciate you guys having me on the show. This has been a fun conversation. I appreciate it, in spite of Coop being weird.
Yeah. That's everybody.
That's a foundational aspect of the show.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, him. Sorry.
That Coop, not you. I already know you're weird.
Listen. Now, my nickname, as people might have surmised, was Coop since about like the 7th grade, and for the rest of my life since then. So being in like a conversation with somebody whose actual name is Coop, I'm still getting used to it, even though it's been a while now.
I'm still getting used to conversation.
Yeah.
Just period. Like just talking, or I mean, that makes sense with a lot of things now. But
yeah.
As Marines, we're never entirely housebroken, so.
In fact, Coop has just been peeing right where he is the whole time. It's
really starting to smell. So.
But no, guys, I really do appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. I love talking about horror stuff, and I always joke that when people ask me what I write, I say, "I'll write whatever you want me to write, as long as you like horror." I'm convinced that most people like horror. They just don't realize it because their mind thinks of one thing, when in reality it's so much more than that. And a lot of the best aspects of the stories that they love are actually little horror tropes. And so I just want, I just try to convince people of that, make them realize that they're not a bunch of wusses and that they actually do like horror.
Folks, make some room in your heart for horror.
That's right.
Johnny Appleseed of horror.
That's right. That's what I try to do.
He's going to plant a seed of it in every story he can.
Yeah.
Anybody else got anything else to plug before we pull the plug on this over 3-hour conversation?
Mike, I'm told that you wrote a book once.
Oh, that's
allegedly.
That's not true. People should. If there's anybody listening to this who doesn't know who I am or that I've written books, you should just Google me, and like my name is pretty easy to find. You'll find me in like some hotels in Finland. So I'm the one with the books, and you should. I would appreciate if you buy those. I have not written horror really, but if you pay me enough money, I absolutely will. So.
Yeah, they'll Google you, and then once they get past the arrest warrants, then they'll get to the books.
You know what? That was I'm a different person. I'm reformed.
It'll be better next time, baby. I swear.
Yeah, I will started going by Coop in the 7th grade because that's when he changed his name legally.
That was Jack setting him up anyway.
Yeah, I will say that, Pete, when you said like, "Hey, anybody got anything else?" I was ready for you to go like any caveats. As at the end of every military morning meeting there. Any
Right,
caveats?
known bitches complaints.
And somebody always like ups would a caveat that with a caveat is not a verb.
Just to piggyback off of what Pete said.
Any save rounds? Okay.
Yeah, we're here
all
till
getting
4
close
hours,
up
and it's
here.
just
Gentlemen, it's been fun. So I'm going to say good night, and I'll see you guys next time.
We are out.